The girl, the fire, the dog who waited. They said she survived something no child should remember. They said the nightmares never really ended. But no one talks about the dog. The one who stood at her side when the world had turned its back. The one with the torn paw pads and the quiet gaze. The one who never flinched when she screamed in her sleep. Vega wasn't a therapy dog when they found him. He wasn't trained, wasn't certified. But some wounds don't ask for credentials, they ask for presence. And he gave it every day, without question. This story isn't about a miracle, not the kind with fireworks or perfect endings. It's about slow mornings, tiny nods of trust, and the healing that comes when someone, human or not, refuses to leave. If you've ever wondered what makes a soul come back to life, or what it looks like when a dog becomes more than just a dog, this story will answer you. Softly, honestly, and completely. The dawn over Millstone usually arrived slow and soft, like an old lullaby. The sky, smeared in pale hues of lavender and wheat, stretched lazily across the treetops. This was the kind of place where time moved in exhaled sighs, not in sirens, where back porches held old swings and neighbors left their doors unlocked more out of habit than trust. But not that morning. At precisely 5:37 a.m., a streak of orange split the horizon, not the kind birthed by sunrise, but the violent kind that devoured. A small one-story home near the end of Sycamore Lane was ablaze. The flames clawed skyward, painting jagged silhouettes against the sleepy countryside as smoke surged upward in angry curls, blackening the calm. The fire department's dispatch notes would later say, "Fully involved on arrival," but no report would ever capture what it felt like to stand on that narrow dirt road and hear the house scream. When the first engine arrived, it was already too late for structure walls caved in like rotted paper, windows shattered with inward pulls of oxygen-starved lungs. What remained was a skeletal frame, snapping and folding in on itself with the crackle of betrayal. The front yard was littered with toys. A small red tricycle turned on its side, plastic blocks melted together in surreal shapes. A singed soccer ball flattened against the curb. The smoke didn't rise and drift, it lingered. It clung to the air like a memory no one wanted to keep but couldn't wash away. Even after the hoses hissed and the flames died under the steady pressure of water, the silence that followed felt louder than the fire. Detective Daniel Rhodes stepped out of his cruiser just as the coroner arrived. He was used to crime scenes, used to death. But there was something about this one that crawled under his skin and settled behind his ribs. Maybe it was the smell, not just smoke, but something sharper, like burned innocence. Or maybe it was the yellow tape that fluttered in the morning breeze, like a warning someone had been too late to hang. The family had been a quiet one. A single mother working nights at the diner and her 2 children. Mateo, 5, with curls like wild dandelions. And Clara, just 3, who rarely spoke even before the fire. Neighbors would later describe them with sad fondness. Sweet kids, kept to themselves, polite, one woman cried, remembering how Mateo used to wave at her garden gnome every morning. Firefighters found Mateo first. He had been curled up in the hallway near his sister's bedroom like he had been running toward her. His small body was shielded partially by a fallen beam. His eyes were closed, face soot-smudged, skin blistered. Rhodes stood over the sheeted body and felt his throat close. No detective training in the world prepares you for the size of a child's shoes. But then came a whisper on the radio of the medics calling urgently from inside the debris. They had found someone alive. Clara was discovered in a closet, behind a stack of coats, beneath a fallen rod and the scorched edges of a winter jacket. Wrapped in a soot-stained blanket, she was holding something against her chest-a-cloth doll with one eye missing, and part of its dress melted into warped threads. She didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't cry. When they lifted her from the wreckage, she kept her face turned toward the doll, as if it had shielded her from a truth too heavy to look at. Her arms wrapped around it with such force the medic had to carefully peel the fibers from her clenched fingers just to check her pulse. "She's alert, but unresponsive," the medic said, his voice shaky. "No burns, no injuries, just locked inside herself." Rhodes watched as the stretcher rolled past. Clara's tiny frame shivering under a thermal blanket despite the heat. Her eyes wide and empty followed no one. Not the sirens, not the flashing lights. Only the doll. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the blackened lawn, firefighters began their investigation. The blaze had been hot unnaturally so for a small structure fire. Yet there was no trace of an accelerant. No melted gas canisters. No faulty wiring that made sense. No signs of forced entry. Everything flammable was gone, but not in a way that screamed accident. It was as if someone had known exactly how to make everything burn just enough. The security cameras on the street were old, busted, or non-existent. No neighbors had seen anything. The mother had been working an overnight double verified. The only person in the immediate vicinity unaccounted for during the window of time was Wyatt Crowley, a 52-year-old man who lived 2 doors down in a sagging bungalow with newspaper-stuffed windows. Rhodes knew the name. Wyatt had been investigated once 2 years ago for an incident involving a different child in the neighborhood. Nothing concrete, no conviction, just whispers. The file read, "Dismissed due to lack of evidence." This time, there was no confession, no bloodied knife, no fuel canister with his fingerprints. There was only a doll and a little girl who refused to speak. The emergency room at Millstone Regional was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes against waxed floors and the low hum of machines. Morning light filtered through frosted windows, softening the sterile corners of the pediatric trauma unit. But nothing could soften what had arrived hours earlier. Clara Alvarez lay motionless on the hospital bed, 3 years old, wrapped in a thin, white blanket that looked too large for her small body. Her face was smudged with ash that no one had dared to wipe away. Her hair, once braided in the quick, careless way of working mothers, was matted and tangled, and cradled against her chest, untouched since the moment she was found, was the doll. What had once been pink was now a mottled gray, its fabric hardened in places where heat had melted thread into plastic. One eye missing, the other clouded over like a storm. But to Clara, it was whole. She held it not like a toy, but like a lifeline, the only piece of her world that hadn't been reduced to ash. She hadn't cried, not when the paramedics lifted her from the wreckage, not when they cleaned the soot from under her nails, not when they whispered her name in gentle voices she didn't recognize, not even when they told her softly, carefully, that her brother wasn't coming back. Dr. Elaine Rivers stood just outside the curtain, arms crossed, eyes rimmed red, not from exhaustion, but from helplessness. She had worked in pediatric trauma for 17 years. She had seen children scream until their throats gave out, seen them lash, claw, collapse into grief. But this quiet, this absence, was somehow worse. "She hasn't said a word?" Rhodes asked, voice low beside her. Dr. Rivers shook her head. "Not even a sound. She blinks, she breathes, but it's like she's not here. Her body's sitting up, but the rest of her, gone." He stepped in slowly, careful not to let the soles of his boots squeak against the linoleum. Clara didn't look up. Her eyes were open, fixed on a spot somewhere between the wall and nowhere at all. "Is she drugged?" he asked quietly. "No, she's just shut down." Rhodes studied the way Clara's fingers were wrapped around the doll's scorched dress, knuckles white, tips purpling. A nurse had tried earlier to gently loosen her grip just enough to scan the doll for any trace evidence. Clara had responded with the only emotion she'd shown, a sharp, hoarse gasp, followed by sobs that never reached her eyes. Her breathing had turned ragged, her skin clammy. They gave the doll back within seconds. "She knows something," Rhodes murmured. "Even if she can't say it, she remembers everything," Dr. Rivers replied. "Her mind's just locked the door." A beat of silence passed. "Selective mutism," she continued. "It's trauma. Induced. The brain reacts like a circuit breaker. Shuts off the speech center to protect the psyche. She's not choosing this. Her system is just overwhelmed." Rhodes sighed, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. "What's the timeline?" Dr. Rivers hesitated. "Could be days, could be months, or never. There's no clock on this kind of silence." He stepped back, eyes drifting to the open case file tucked under his arm. "No accelerant found. No gas leak. No faulty wiring. Fire investigators said it burned hot concentrated. Intentional, but clean. Too clean. Dr. Rivers looked at him. So you think someone did this? I think someone wanted it to look like no one did. Rhodes opened the file. A photo paperclip to the first page showed Wyatt Crowley standing just outside the crowd, line arms folded, expression caught between grief and performance. He had been there during the fire, one of the first on the scene, offering to help before anyone asked, asking questions too quickly, crying too loud. He'd lived 2 doors down from the Alvarez family. A loner, middle-aged, once accused of child endangerment but never charged. That case had gone nowhere like smoke through a broken screen door. But this time, Rhodes had a feeling. One he didn't like. He flipped another page. Interview notes. Wyatt had claimed to be home watching television. Later, he said he had gone to the store. Then, hours later, he claimed he'd visited a friend name, conveniently forgotten. 3 alibis, none confirmed. But no prints, no surveillance, no solid proof. All they had was a girl who wouldn't speak, and a doll that had survived the flames. Is it possible, Rhodes asked slowly, that she's not muting just from trauma, but from fear? Dr. Rivers frowned. You mean if she saw something? If she remembers someone? He nodded. And maybe she thinks if she speaks, they'll come back. A heavy quiet settled between them, broken only by the faint beep of a heart monitor down the hall. Inside the room, Clara remained still. Then, barely perceptible, her fingers shifted, tightening against the doll's burnt fabric. It wasn't much, but to Rhodes, it felt like something was trying to surface, a ripple beneath ice. The house had stopped burning hours ago, but in the minds of those who watched it collapse, it still smoldered. Flashbacks were like that, ghosts dressed in memory. They crept in without warning, reshaping details you didn't realize your brain had recorded. And for several residents of Sycamore Lane, one memory stood out, not in flames, but in voice. Where's the girl? Did they get the kids out? Is the mom here? Did she know they were alone? Should I go check the backyard? I think I saw something behind the shed. Wyatt Crowley had been the first to speak. He wasn't a stranger to the neighborhood, more like a tolerated fixture. 52, with a weathered ball cap and deep lines around his mouth that made it hard to tell if he was frowning or just stuck that way. He lived alone in a brown-paneled bungalow choked by untrimmed hedges and plastic lawn chairs that had bleached gray from too many summers. No kids, no visitors, just static on the television and cheap beer on the porch. But the morning of the fire, he wasn't sitting alone. He was front and center, practically climbing over the yellow tape before it was even secured. Detective Rhodes played the body cam footage again. It had been recorded by Officer Hunt, one of the first on scene. The timestamp flickered faintly in the corner. 5:49 a.m. Wyatt's voice came from just outside frame. I can help, seriously. I used to do volunteer EMT work years ago. Maybe I can check the back. Then he came into view, shirtless under a half-zipped windbreaker, eyes darting. Sweating, though it was barely 50 degrees out, he spoke rapidly, volume rising with each sentence. Rhodes hit pause. It wasn't illegal to offer help. It wasn't suspicious to ask questions. But something in Wyatt's tone wasn't concern. It was eagerness. As if he wanted to be seen doing the right thing, more than he wanted the right thing done. The neighbors noticed too. Mrs. Garland, the retired teacher next door, told Rhodes during a doorstep interview he was odd, loud, too loud. Didn't even know their names before this, and suddenly he's acting like he's part of the family. Another neighbor said he saw Wyatt pacing in his driveway when the first flame started, just standing there watching. Rhodes closed the interview notes. They didn't prove anything, but they didn't sit right either. Back at the precinct, Wyatt was brought in for informal questioning. He didn't seem nervous, just busy, like he had somewhere else to be. He spoke in half-thoughts and contradicted himself 3 times before the end of the first hour. I was home, watching some true crime show, American Bloodlines or something. Later. Actually, I think I was grabbing milk. That corner place, Westmart. Still later. I stopped by a friend's, Ricky something. Can't remember his last name. Lives up near the hills. Rhodes pressed gently. So, which is it, home? Store or a friend's house? Wyatt blinked, then gave a tight laugh. Geez, I don't know. It was early. I don't even remember what I had for breakfast that day. You didn't mention breakfast, Rhodes replied calmly. Wyatt's eyes narrowed, lips twitching. Is this an interrogation? Not unless you want it to be. Rhodes ended the session early. He didn't want to spook the man. Not yet. He needed more. Something physical, tangible. But the fire had eaten everything. No fingerprints, no accelerants, no security footage, no confession. And Clara was still silent. The days that followed were a holding pattern. The crime scene was cold. The evidence locker was nearly empty. Detectives chased shadows while the public shifted their attention elsewhere. Small-town tragedy. Processed and archived. Rhodes sat alone in his office one night, flipping through reports, his third cup of coffee gone cold beside him. The photo of Clara sat on the desk corner. In it, she wasn't smiling, but she wasn't hollow either. Her eyes looked curious. Open. A girl who still believed the world had soft places. Now, all she had left was ash and a doll. He stared at the report from Dr. Rivers again. Selective mutism likely to persist. No timeline for recovery. Child's attachment to surviving object, scorched doll, is psychologically anchored. Removal not recommended. Rhodes leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. If Clara couldn't tell them what happened, they had no one left who could. Unless they found someone or something that didn't need words. He stood suddenly and crossed to the file cabinet by the window. It hadn't been touched in months, layered with dust. He pulled open the second drawer. K9 unit. Past cases. Rhodes hadn't worked with a dog since 2017, but he remembered the way some of them could pick up what humans missed scent traces, stress responses, emotional residues left behind like fingerprints on air. Most of the active K9s were trained for narcotics, explosive detection, or patrol, but there had been one. He flipped through the files, then stopped. Vega, German Shepherd, unit, disaster response, status, retired, unfit. The note beside it caught his eye. Handler deceased in Tennessee collapse. Dog sustained multiple injuries. Deemed behaviorally fragile, prone to hyper-empathy response. Removed from active roster. Behaviorally fragile, but not broken. Rhodes ran a finger down the page until he found the trainer's name scribbled in red ink at the bottom corner. Mason Lee, independent contractor. Sanctuary Ridge K9 Rehab. He stared at the name, then at Clara's photo, then the doll. What if the key to unlocking the truth wasn't what Clara could say, but what she remembered through scent, through connection? Sometimes, Rhodes thought, we forget that not every witness speaks in court. Some just point with their presence. He picked up the phone and dialed. The precinct basement smelled like paper and dust, an odd mix of the forgotten and the official. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, flickering every so often as if protesting their own neglect. Detective Rhodes stood alone beneath them, jacket slung over one chair, sleeves rolled to his elbows. The only sound, the slow slide of old file drawers opening and closing. He hated this room. It was where cases went to die. Old records, decommissioned files, units disbanded, names erased by time and bureaucracy. Shelves packed tight with cardboard boxes that no one touched, unless they were looking for something long buried or something they didn't want anyone else to find. Rhodes ran a hand down the spine of a folder labeled K9 Archive, Retired, Non-Operational. It was a thick binder, heavier than it looked. The paper inside had yellowed around the edges. Notes were handwritten, sometimes scribbled in haste, sometimes underlined twice as if trying to keep the dog's story from slipping into silence. He flipped past narcotics units, patrol trackers, bomb squad dogs. Each had an end date. Some were retired with honor. Others listed injuries, PTSD, behavioral instability. But then, near the back tucked into a section rarely opened, he saw the name. Vega. Breed. German Shepherd. Age 6. Previous unit. FEMA Disaster Response. Deployment history. Oklahoma tornadoes. Montana wildfires. Tennessee building collapse. Status. Inactive. Reason. Handler deceased in field. Dog sustained multiple rib fractures. Internal bruising. Third-degree burns. Exhibits high reactivity to distress. Behavioral evaluation. Emotionally overloaded. Hyper. Attuned to human pain. No longer suitable for high-stress deployment. In. Rhodes stared at the final line. Recommended for retirement. Too sensitive. He let out a quiet breath. Too sensitive. What a phrase. They stamped it on dogs the same way they did on people who refused to shut their eyes in the face of pain, as if empathy were a malfunction instead of a gift. Attached to the report was a black and white photo granny, taken after the Tennessee collapse. Vega stood in front of a pile of wreckage, snout dusted in ash, eyes fixed on something out of frame. A harness hung loose over his shoulders. One strap burned clean through. The edges of his fur looked singed, but his posture low, steady, resolute spoke of a dog that didn't flinch. According to the notes, Vega had found 6 survivors in that collapse, 6 people buried under concrete and flame. The last one, teenage girl pinned beneath a fallen elevator shaft, was located only because Vega had refused to leave the spot, even as rubble shifted beneath him. His handler, Officer Jamie Greer, had gone back in to pull her out. The shaft collapsed during the rescue. Jamie didn't make it. Vega barely did. It took them 3 hours to dig the dog out. Broken ribs, burned flank, crushed paw. The report said he whined once, then went quiet. After that, no department wanted to use him again. He trembled during simulations, refused to enter dark spaces. He flinched at raised voices. One handler had called him a ghost of what he used to be. And yet, Rhodes turned the page. Taped to the bottom was a note, small, almost overlooked. Trainer, Mason Lee, Private Rehabilitation, Sanctuary Ridge, K-9 Center. Status, ongoing. Personal investment. No funding requested. A different handwriting followed. Still works with Vega daily. No expectations, just patience. Rhodes stared at that sentence, longer than he needed to. Just patience. He knew the name Mason Lee. A former K-9 officer, him quiet, soft-spoken, known for taking dogs others had written off. Rhodes had met him once, years ago, during a joint training op in Colorado. Mason had said almost nothing the entire day. But the dogs he worked with, they listened like he spoke their language. Rhodes closed the binder and tucked it under his arm. The doll, Clara. The silent child and the dog who flinched at yelling. He didn't believe in fate, but he did believe in instinct. And something in his gut told him that Vega might be the only creature left on Earth who could reach the girl with no voice. He climbed the basement steps 2 at a time, his shoes thudding against the old cement. In his office upstairs, he dialed the number scrawled at the bottom of the file. The phone rang twice before it was answered. Sanctuary Ridge, came a voice steady, low, and warm like flannel in winter. Mason Lee? Rhodes asked. A pause, then, speaking, a crate. This is Detective Rhodes. I'm calling about a dog, one I believe you're still working with. His name is Vega. Another pause. The kind that felt like someone looking out a window and remembering something they hadn't said in years. I still have him, Mason said finally. Why? Rhodes looked toward the photo of Clara. Still sitting on the edge of his desk, blank eyes frozen in a frame too heavy for any child. I have a girl who doesn't speak, Rhodes said, and a doll that smells like smoke. I need a dog who remembers pain. Mason didn't ask for details. He didn't ask for permission. He simply said, send me the scent. Mason lived alone now, if you didn't count the dogs. The farm he ran sat at the edge of nowhere, stretch of golden pasture hemmed by forest, where silence was not absence but presence, of wind through old pines, of the occasional low bark from a training pen, of the slow beat of healing hearts. His hands bore the cracked texture of someone who worked more with fur and dirt than with people. His gait was heavy, but measured like a man who had carried grief long enough to fold it neatly in his pocket. At the edge of the training yard, the old German shepherd sat still, watching nothing, or maybe watching everything. Vega didn't run anymore, not the way he used to. His left leg still carried a tremble from the explosion, though the fur had grown back, hiding most of the damage. What it didn't hide were the scars on his side, pale, jagged lines that ran like ghost fingers along his ribcage. A story no one could hear. A wound no one had the right to name. He's temperamental. Mason had told Detective Rhodes, resting a gentle hand on Vega's flank, as if shielding him from the weight of the world. But if anyone can read a child, it's him, if he chooses to. Rhodes had nodded, unsure what he was looking, a damaged asset or something closer to holy. Mason stepped back as Rhodes approached with the evidence bag. Inside it, the doll. It was nearly unrecognizable. Its face blackened by soot, a button eye half melted, a fraying patchwork dress clinging to the fabric body. Yet somehow, despite the ruin, it reeked of something raw and real. Smoke, ash, salt, memory. Vega didn't react at first. He just blinked once, slow and deliberate, like an old man calculating risk. Then Mason unsealed the bag. He didn't even need to hold it out. The second the scent hit the air, Vega's ears pricked. His nose lifted, nostrils flaring, as something buried surged forward. He rose a knot with the limping caution of an injured dog, but with the low, focused gravity of a soldier recalling his purpose. His body went rigid, not in fear, recognition. He moved toward the doll slowly, as if being drawn rather than choosing. He sniffed once, then twice each breath, a trembling thread connecting scent to something deeper, a place beyond the memory of smoke. Then he did something neither Mason nor Rhodes expected. He whimpered. It was barely audible, just a catch in the throat, but it was sharp enough to silence the air around them. Mason crouched beside him, watching the shift in his eyes. "I haven't seen that look since the field hospital," Mason murmured. "Back when he found those girls, buried under the old school after the quake. He knew they were there, knew before the humans did." Rhodes didn't speak. He was watching Vega like one might watch a storm gathering behind glass. The detective pulled out the photo Clara, clinging to the same doll, her face streaked with ash and silence. Vega stared. And then, without command or cue, he sat beside the image. Not on it, beside it, like a sentinel guarding memory. He didn't break eye contact with the photo, as if willing her to speak through it. Mason lowered his voice. "Looks like he's made his decision." That night, as stars blinked coldly over the quiet pasture, Mason brushed Vega's coat by the barn's warm lamplight. The old shepherd rested his head on Mason's knee, but there was no sleep behind those amber eyes. Just a pull, a tug, like something was calling him back into the fire. "You're not just sensing the girl," Mason said gently, carding fingers through the thick fur. "You're remembering what it means to be needed." Vega didn't move, but his breathing slowed, the kind of exhale that signaled a readiness Mason hadn't seen in months. They had tried to retire him, tried to label him too reactive, too sensitive, too broken, but no one had thought to ask the dog if he was done. Now, as Mason looked at the fading scars along Vega's ribs, he no longer saw defeat. He saw a map. Every wound, a coordinate pointing towards something he hadn't yet done, some purpose not yet fulfilled. At dawn, Rhodes returned. He didn't ask if Vega was ready. He just opened the car door. Vega jumped in without hesitation. It wasn't the leap of a healed body. It was the surrender of a determined soul. No fanfare, no barking, just presence. Before they drove off, Mason leaned in through the window, holding Vega's collar between two weathered fingers. "You're not going in as a hero," he whispered. "You're going in as hope." Then he stepped back. And for the first time in 8 months, Vega didn't look back. He faced forward, toward a little girl who hadn't spoken, toward a doll that reeked of ash, toward a fire only he could walk through. The soft interview room wasn't much more than a padded box, its walls pastel blue, its floor layered with thick carpet, as if silence could soak into the threads. Toys lay neatly arranged along a low shelf. A small table sat unused in the corner. The one bright light came from a frosted dome above, casting no shadows, no corners to hide in. Clara didn't move. She sat curled in a plush gray chair, legs tucked beneath her, arms locked tight around her stomach. Her shoes dangled from the edge of the cushion. Her face, too, still for a child, was turned to the wall. The same wall she'd been staring at for 22 minutes, according to the therapist's notes. She had not spoken, not cried, not blinked much. Her doll, once clutched with white-knuckled terror, now lay limp in her lap. The stitched eyes stared at nothing. The therapist, a gentlewoman named Dr. Kessler, had tried everything. Books, puppets, silly questions, silent companionship. Nothing worked. From behind the one-way mirror, Detective Rhodes stood with his arms folded. He hadn't blinked much either. Beside him, Mason waited, one hand resting loosely on Vega's harness. Vega had not barked once since they entered the building. "Are you sure about this?" Rhodes asked quietly. "She hasn't responded to any human contact." Mason didn't answer right away. He looked down at Vega. The dog's posture was still. No tension, no tail wag, just awareness, as if the room had already spoken to him. Rhodes exhaled. "Okay, let's see what he does." With a silent nod, Mason unlatched the door. Vega walked in on it, fast, not cautious. He didn't look at the therapist or sniff the room like most dogs would. Instead, he moved with an odd gravity, as though something pulled him forward that no one else could feel. Clara didn't notice at first. Then the doll slipped. It tumbled from her lap to the floor with a soft thud. It was in that moment, that fragile, ordinary moment, Vega acted. He paused for half a second. Then, without a sound, he walked over, nose low. He didn't sniff her, didn't lick. He didn't sit and wait for a command. He simply nudged the doll, gently, delicately, as if it were a sacred thing. He pushed it closer to her foot and stopped, sat her down, looked at her, not begging, not pleading, just present. Clara blinked. She turned her head, slow as rain sliding down a window. Her eyes landed not on the therapist, not on the mirror, on Vega. And for the first time in days, her body moved not away, but toward. She slid from the chair, knees creaking slightly, and crawled the few inches to her doll. She picked it up. Her hand brushed Vega's paw. She didn't flinch. The therapist froze. Rhodes held his breath. Clara pressed the doll to her chest. Then, without a word, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against Vega's shoulder. The room cracked open. Vega didn't move. His ears relaxed, his body softened, but he stayed where he was, letting her choose every inch of contact. Outside the glass, Rhodes murmured, "She's responding." Mason said nothing. His gaze was locked not on the girl, but on Vega. The dog's eyes had shifted. That glint of something buried instinct. Maybe memory shimmered behind them. The stillness wasn't just calm. It was knowing. Inside the room, Clara let out the smallest of sounds. A breath. A hiccup. Not quite a cry, but not silence either. Dr. Kessler didn't interfere. She stayed seated, notebook limp in her lap. She knew a fragile bridge when she saw an and knew better than to walk across it too soon. Vega lay down slowly, one paw stretched forward, the other curled beneath him. Clara mirrored the motion. She didn't speak, didn't look at anyone else, but her fingers gripped his fur like it was a lifeline. Rhodes cleared his throat. "I've seen hardened survivors refuse therapy for years. Nothing. But that dog walks in." Mason finally broke his silence. "He wasn't supposed to be this way. They said he was done, too sensitive to redeploy." "Sensitive?" Rhodes echoed. "That's what saved her just now." A quiet moment passed between them. Then Rhodes said low, "If she'll follow him, maybe she'll lead us somewhere." Mason nodded. "Then we follow her." Inside the soft room, Clara shifted closer, her cheek pressed to Vega's side. The doll lay beside her now, its presence no longer white-knuckled. "And Vega?" He blinked once, closed his eyes, not in sleep, in peace. The soft interview room had grown familiar, its muted walls, the warm-toned lamp that hummed faintly in the corner, the plush armchair where Clara always sat curled into herself like something too small for this world. Every day, at exactly 10 in the morning, she and Detective Rhodes would arrive. She'd clutch the doll with her left hand, white-knuckled, silent, always silent, and Vega would wait. He never rushed. Vega's steps were patient, slow, deliberate. He moved with the calm grace of something that had seen fire and walked out of it still breathing. His coat had grown thicker since his time at the training farm, but scars still traced down his ribs beneath the fur testaments to a past Clara didn't yet understand, but perhaps felt. The first day, she flinched when he entered the room. No cry, no words, just a silent withdrawal of her limbs, like a flower folding in at dusk. But Vega didn't press. He merely sat, a quiet, unmoving shadow at the door. He didn't look at her directly, just breathed in her fear and didn't mirror it. By the third visit, she began to sketch. The crayons they gave her were blunt from overuse, all dull pastels. Still, she chose the same shade of gray every time row strokes of a dog's outline on construction paper. Sometimes, she'd shade it in. Sometimes not. Once, she drew eyes so detailed they stopped Rhodes in his tracks. "They're his," he whispered to Mason later, holding the sketch up to the light. "That's Vega's gaze. It wasn't just the color. It was the knowing." She never looked at people, not directly. But when Vega entered, her eyes followed him like he was a language she hadn't forgotten. Her shoulders didn't stiffen. Her hand stayed steady. And the doll, the one she had clung to like a raft in open sea sometimes, slipped from her grasp when Vega came near. It became a silent ritual. Vega would enter and pause. Clara would wait until he lay down, always facing her but never too close. Then, if the doll dropped softly, as though by accident, would nose it gently back toward her, and she would take it, but her fingers would linger against his fur just a second longer each time. Mason watched it unfold behind the two-way glass, arms crossed, lips tight. "This is different," he murmured to Rhodes. "This isn't just rapport. It's recognition." Rhodes tilted his head. "From her." "No," Mason said. "From him." There was something in Vega's stillness, in the way his ears tilted only when Clara moved, in how his breathing matched hers without effort. He wasn't just watching her. He was waiting for her. On the 7th visit, Clara placed her palm flat, quiet in Vega's chest. It was brief, less than 3 seconds. But the act sent a hush through the observation room like a curtain falling. She hadn't touched anyone in days. Not the nurses, not the therapist, not Rhodes, even when he offered his coat on that rainy afternoon. But here she was, pressing her small hand into the soft fur just above Vega's scarred ribs. He didn't move. Her fingers twitched slightly, tracing something no one else could see. Then she pulled back and returned to her drawing pad, where she began adding something new, a thick line of fur beneath the belly. A ridge, a wound. She had never seen his scars. They were covered by fur, hidden by the way he sat. But she drew them anyway. Mason leaned forward, his voice caught halfway between wonder and dread. "She knows." The next morning, Clara entered with no doll. Her arms were empty, her steps unsure. Rhodes crouched low instinctively, preparing to ask where it was, if she'd forgotten, if it had been taken. But then he saw Vega already in the room, sitting, waiting. And Clara moved to him. She didn't hesitate, just sat down beside the dog, not across the room, not in her usual chair, beside him. She rested her back against his side. It wasn't a hug, it wasn't even a lean, it was surrender. The room fell so still. Even the fluorescent light overhead seemed to dim in reverence. Vega turned his head slightly, pressed his nose to her shoulder, and exhaled. She didn't flinch. Her breathing matched his again, the same rise and fall, the same tempo. "I think this is her first word," said the therapist quietly behind the glass. Mason nodded. "And it's not spoken." "Oh." They sat that way for 40 minutes. No one dared interrupt. When Clara finally stood, she didn't take her sketchbook, her crayons, or even her jacket. She just looked once at Vega's, locking with his in a way that made Rhodes shiver, and then left the room. The silence she carried was no longer hollow. It was waiting to be filled. The hospital room smelled faintly of crayons now. It was subtle buried beneath the sterile sting of disinfectant and the quiet hum of medical machines. But to Margaret, Clara's grandmother, it was the first scent of hope in weeks. Hope, oddly enough, smelled like Crayola and warm paper. Clara sat by the window in a small padded chair, her tiny body wrapped in a fleece blanket with blue stars. Her feet didn't reach the floor, and her back was hunched in quiet concentration. In her left arm, as always, was the threadbare dollet's face smeared with soot, its eyes slightly melted from heat. She never let go of it, not even to sleep. It was her anchor, her wall, her secret. But her right hand, her drawing hand moved today. Margaret stood at the doorway, half holding her breath. She'd seen Clara hold crayons before, even scribble in silence. But this was different. Clara wasn't just scribbling. She was remembering. And remembering, Margaret knew, was the first real step toward Helingor breaking. The page filled slowly. Crayon lines were firm, deliberate. A figure took shape small, fragile, sitting in what looked unmistakably like a wheelchair. That alone made Margaret's throat tighten. Clara hadn't used one in over a year, not since she began walking again after her corrective surgery. Beside the girl in the drawing was a second shape, a four-legged figure, thick in the chest, alert in posture. The ears were too pointy. The eyes, though just dots, carried something impossible. Presence. It was Vega. Not a generic dog, not a cartoon puppy. It was him, the dog, who sat now curled at Clara's feet like a silent sentinel, eyes half-lidded, always watching. Margaret stepped in, careful not to make her footsteps loud. "Sweetheart," she said softly. Clara didn't look up, but her crayon paused for a beat. Then she reached for the yellow. The sun came next drawn into the upper right corner of the paper. It had rays that stretched out like fingers. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even fully round, but it was there. After weeks of charcoal grays, scratchy blacks, and hard red streaks that looked like screams frozen on paper, the sun was back. Margaret couldn't help it. Her eyes flooded. Clara didn't cry. She didn't speak. But she drew. When the picture was done, Clara didn't hand it over. She placed it on the small tray table beside her and turned back toward Vega. The dog lifted his head just slightly and, without being told, nudged her wrist with his nose-ons, soft, like a breath. Clara's fingers opened. For the first time in 17 days, the doll was no longer in her grip. It fell gently, like a wilted petal onto her lap. Her other hand reached out, tentative, tremulous, and settled on Vega's back. Margaret watched that moment like a person watching the tide roll back after a hurricane. Slowly, something was coming back to shore. She picked up the drawing and stared. Yes, the girl in the picture was in a wheelchair. And yes, Vega stood next to her like a shadow with a heart. But what caught Margaret wasn't those two shapes. It was the center. In the very middle of the drawing beneath the sun, beside the girl and dog, was the doll. Clara had drawn it exactly as it was now. Scorched. Tilted head. Burned fabric fraying at the neck. It wasn't idealized or clean. It was true. As if Clara, in her silence, was telling the world, "This is where I was when it happened. This is what came with me through the fire." And yet there was color now. The dress of the girl was soft, pink. The wheels of the chair, pale blue. Vega's fur was shaded in gray, with small dots of brown. The dolledly was drawn with a purple sash around its chest. In real life, the doll never had a sash. Margaret blinked, staring. "What is that, honey?" she asked, pointing to the ribbon. Clara didn't answer, but her eyes flicked toward the page. "Vega satt streiter." Margaret felt her skin prickle. "I'll show this to Detective Rhodes," she said quietly, half to herself. Still no response from the child. But as Margaret folded the drawing into a clear folder, she felt something new fill the room. Not relief. Not yet, but momentum. The static air of waiting had finally stirred. Clara was remembering. Maybe not aloud, but with color, with images, and with Vega. Later that evening, a therapist came in, Dr. Elsner, a kind-eyed man with tired shoulders. He asked Clara if she wanted to draw again. She didn't move. But when Vega padded forward and sat beside the paper tray, Clara picked up the crayon box and offered it to him. She held it out like a gift, as if to say, "You start." Vega did not, of course, but he tilted his head and made a low sound in his throat, something between a sigh and a hum. Clara smiled. She smiled. Margaret, watching from the edge of the hallway, gripped the doorframe so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Thank you," she whispered to no one in particular, but she knew who she meant. The late afternoon light spilled into Dr. Elaine Rivers' office in long, tired beams, catching flecks of dust in midair. Detective Rhodes leaned forward, arms on his knees, his badge glinting faintly beneath the fold of his coat. Across from him, Dr. Rivers turned a page in Clara's chart, then stilled her hand. Her face was thoughtful, concerned, but there was something else there too, a pause before a leap. "She's not getting worse," she said, closing the folder slowly. "But she's also not stepping out of the space she's built. Not fully." Rhodes followed her gaze to the security monitor in the upper corner. It showed a silent feed of the soft interview room. Clara sat on the carpet, her back against the wall, doll in lap. Vega lay beside her like a guardian carved from breath and muscle. She wasn't touching him, not exactly, but her shoulder leaned just enough to share warmth. "She's been drawing." Rhodes's voice was low, careful. "Colors coming back into her lines. There's one sketch of the doll on the windowsill. The room's burning around it. But no people, no fire." "Doctor." Rivers tapped her finger gently against her temple. "Trauma fragments, memory. Especially in children. Sometimes the body remembers what the mouth can't say." She folded her hands together and looked at him directly. "We may have reached the limit of the sterile room." Rhodes raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning the courtroom," she said. "Not to testify. Just observe. With Vega." He blinked. "You want to put her in the same building as the man she may have seen kill her parents?" "Doctor." Rivers didn't flinch. "Yes. Because that building also holds the hallway she may have walked through, the rail she may have gripped, the bench she may have hidden under. Objects can trigger recall. The doll only brought her part way." Rhodes stood, ran a hand through his hair, then sat back down. "That's a hell of a risk." "I know. If she spirals, she won't be alone. She'll have Vega. And me." Rhodes exhaled sharply through his nose, the beginnings of resistance cracking into consideration. He looked again at the monitor. Vega had moved, just slightly. His paw now lay across Clara's foot. "She doesn't speak," he muttered. "She doesn't need to," Dr. Rivers said quietly. "Not yet." The proposal met a room full of raised brows and folded arms. They gathered in the courtroom's back conference room. Rhodes, Rivers, Assistant DA, Molina, a child advocate from the state, and Judge Helen Whitmore, known for her razor-sharp gaze and zero tolerance for emotional appeals. "You're asking me," Whitmore said slowly, "to allow a child witness with diagnosed trauma to be present at a hearing involving the man suspected of murdering her family?" "She won't be testifying," Dr. Rivers said, calm but steady. "She won't be seen. We're requesting observation only, through a side view window, one-way glass." And the dog?" Whitmore's eyebrow arched. "Vega is retired military K-9, Rhodes cut in. Handled PTSD units, recovery search, trauma support. He's stabilized. He's the only being she responds to." Whitmore turned to Molina. "Thoughts?" Molina adjusted her glasses. "Legally, we're not at risk unless the child is improperly identified or approached. If precautions are followed and if the guardian consents, I won't oppose it, though I'd want security informed, just in case." Whitmore tapped her pen twice on the folder before her, then looked directly at Rhodes. "If this goes wrong—" "It won't," he said. Clara's grandmother sat with folded hands in her lap, shoulders tense beneath her shawl. She'd been silent through the explanation, the logistics, the safety measures, the rationale. Finally, she spoke. "She was never the same after the fire. But since the dog came, her voice trembled. She looks up again. She reaches." Rhodes nodded gently. "That's why we believe it's time. But it's your decision." She looked to Clara, who sat cross-legged on the rug nearby, coloring. A new drawing. It looked like a hallway, one long line leading to a window. No fire this time, just Vega. "And the doll on the floor. I want her to heal," the grandmother whispered. "I want the truth to find her." The morning of the hearing, Vega was bathed, brushed, and vest-fitted. He did not wear the stiff black harness of his working days, just a soft blue band with a patch that read, "Comfort K-9. Do not pet unless invited." Clara wore her favorite cardigan, pale lavender, sleeves too long. The doll faded, frayed, and clutched tight came with her, nestled in her arms, like always. They entered through the staff access hallway, guided by a child advocate and Mason, who'd come along for Vega's sake. Clara didn't speak, didn't look up, but her steps were even. The viewing room was quiet. Lights dimmed, one-way mirror clean. They settled in behind the glass. The courtroom beyond was already filling lawyers, officers, observers, and then him, Wyatt Crowley. He sat alone at the defense table, his hair slicked back too neatly, his tie too symmetrical. He looked thinner, or maybe just smaller. Clara stilled. Vega didn't move, but the fur along his shoulder rippled once like a whisper against instinct. His eyes tracked Crowley through the glass, His breath deepened. Clara watched. The doll slipped from her hand. She didn't pick it up. Instead, her fingers crept into Vega's fur and held. No cry, no words. But something had changed. Something remembered. The courtroom was colder than it needed to be. Not just in temperature, but in the way sound seemed to echo and vanish at the same time, like grief that had nowhere to land. The walls bore no expression, just dull wood paneling and paint that once tried to look warm. The air hummed with restraint, like everyone had agreed to whisper without being told. Clara sat in the far corner, just out of the jury's view, in a cushioned chair brought in at the therapist's request. Beside her, Vega lay motionless, his thick body stretched along the floor like a silent promise. He didn't blink much, didn't fidget, didn't need to. Because Vega, with all his scars hidden beneath a black and tan coat, was trained to wait. And Clara? Clara didn't speak, but she watched. From her seat, her eyes skimmed the courtroom, past the judge, past the tall man in the navy suit who had spoken softly to her earlier, the one with kind eyes but tired hands, Detective Rhodes. Past the jury box where no one looked at her. All the way to the front where a cloth-covered exhibit table sat under dimmed lights. There, resting between a photograph of a broken garden trellis and a frayed rope belt, was her doll. Exhibit B. The tag was clipped to the edge, official and sterile. Almost cruel in how ordinary it made the doll look. The doll itself was slumped like it too, had been waiting far too long. Its yarn hair tangled, its button eyes loose from years of handling. One arm bore a faint pink smear that no amount of washing had removed, because it wasn't dirt. It was memory, dried into fabric, fixed like a ghost into cloth. Dr. Elaine Rivers sat 2 rows behind Clara, hands folded, breath held in habitual caution. Her gaze flicked from the girl to Vega and then to Rhodes. He didn't nod. He didn't signal. He just watched, too. It had been his idea, after all, to let Clara come. Not to testify, just to feel. She hadn't cried since the day they found her, half buried in sleep and silence. Hadn't uttered a word, but she had drawn. Pictures that pulsed with meaning. A girl in a chair. A son with no face. A dog made of ink and longing. And always, always, the doll centered like a fixed star. The room didn't move. Then very slightly, Clara did. Her right foot shifted, a near imperceptible lean forward, a breath that seemed to stretch longer than the last. Her hand, small and uncertain, moved along Vega's back, fingers disappearing into his fur like she was trying to ground herself. Vega didn't move either, but his ears rose. And so did something else. A tension, barely audible, began to hum in the room. Not loud, not dramatic, just aware. The prosecutor continued questioning the forensic expert on scene documentation. To the rest of the courtroom, it was standard. A necessary beat, a preamble to something heavier. But to Rhodes, Elaine, and Vigate was the opening of a door no one could see. Clara's eyes flicked again toward the exhibit table. This time, her gaze stayed there. She leaned closer, just an inch. The therapist's hand clenched around a pen cap. And then, like a whisper, meant only for Vega, Clara did something no one expected. She slid out of her chair. Slow, careful, knees trembling. The hush that followed wasn't silence, it was the kind of stillness that demanded reverence. She didn't run, didn't stumble. She walked, not far, just a few steps. And Vega, as if drawn by something invisible, yet inevitable, rose too. He didn't bark or whine. He didn't look for permission. He moved beside her like he had always been meant to, like whatever had cracked inside both of them her voice. His nerve had found its other half. No one dared stop her. A bailiff shifted forward and froze. The judge raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Clara stopped 2 feet from the exhibit table. Her fingers twitched at her side, like they weren't sure what to do. Her eyes didn't water, but something shimmered there, something not quite recognition and not quite grief. Then Vega took the lead. He nudged the table gently, his nose brushing the edge where the doll rested. He looked up at Clara, and she finally moved. One hand reached forward. A motion born not of impulse, but memory. Muscle before thought. She touched the doll. Not grabbed, not clutched. Touched. And the moment her fingers made contact, She breathed out a sound, almost a name, almost a sigh. Everyone heard it. It wasn't a word. But it wasn't silence either. Her hand tightened around the doll's waist. Vega sat again, now between her and the rest of the world, like a living shield. Clara turned around, walked back, Saturday, and tucked the doll into her lap without looking up. Elaine bit her lip hard enough to leave an imprint. Rhodes exhaled like someone who hadn't realized he'd been holding air in his chest for days. The judge scribbled something on a notepad but didn't speak. And Vega? He leaned his head gently against Clara's leg, like it was done. Like she'd found something she hadn't even known she'd lost. The courtroom was too quiet, not the solemn quiet of legal proceedings, but the kind that feels like the air is holding its breath, waiting to see if something, anything, might break. Clara sat near the wall, away from the jury box and the cold logic of the judge's bench. Her wheelchair barely creaked as she shifted slightly. Her hands rested in her lap, unmoving. Beside her, Vega sat like a statue, alert, but calm. His gaze didn't flicker. His breathing was slow, controlled, as if he knew that today wasn't just about evidence and verdicts. Today was about something that couldn't be entered into record memory. The doll lay on the exhibit table a few feet ahead, under harsh fluorescent lights that gave everything a washed-out look. The tag beneath it read, Exhibit B, black text on white cardstock, sterile and final. But to Clara, that doll was not a label. It was her last thread, worn at the seams, stained in places, a piece of cloth that remembered what her mind couldn't say. Dr. Rivers sat 3 rows back, eyes on Clara but not pressuring. Detective Rhodes stood in the far corner, arms crossed. He wasn't blinking. His jaw had locked tight an hour ago. The room held its stillness like glass. Then Clara moved. It started with the faintest twitch in her fingers. Her hand curled around the armrest, then uncurled again. She reached for the joystick on her wheelchair, thumb trembling against plastic. Vega's ears flicked back slightly, his body still, but his focus sharpening. The sound of her chair inching forward was barely more than a murmur. No one stopped her. No one breathed. She approached the table as if stepping toward something sacred or cursed. When she reached it, her hands hovered, then slowly reached for the doll. She didn't cradle it like a child would. She held it like something fragile, something that had seen things too awful for its cotton stuffing to hold. Then she turned not to the judge, not to the gallery, but to Vega, and in a movement that felt rehearsed by memory rather than intent, she lowered the doll to Vega's face, pressing it gently to his snout. Vega sniffed once, then again, longer. Something changed in his posture. His body straightened, his neck arched subtly forward, and his nostrils flared in a way that Rhodes had only ever seen during live search operations. Clara held the doll there, eyes locked on Vega. Then came the whisper, barely audible, a breath, not a sentence. He smelled like this. At first, it was so soft the room didn't seem to hear it. But a tiny green light blinked on her collar. The clip-on mic had picked it up. A crackle of feedback. Then silence again. Rhodes jolted just slightly, then stepped forward, signaling to the AV tech, who replayed it through the room's speaker system. The words echoed now, small, trembling, but clear. He smelled like this. Gasps fluttered like wings in the courtroom. One juror covered her mouth. The judge leaned slightly forward, and Vega growled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening, but it was low, guttural, a sound that rumbled from the chest, not the throat, not a warning, a recognition. Vega's eyes had narrowed, fixed not on Clara, not on the doll, but on someone in the gallery. Second row, left side, Wyatt Crowley. The man in the pressed gray suit, crisp shirt, no tie, just enough unshaven edge to look casual. Just enough polish to pass for clean. His fingers twitched as Vega stared. For the first time in 2 hours, Crowley broke eye contact, looked down, shifted in his seat. Rhodes didn't move yet. But Vega did. He stood, calmly, steadily, his shoulders high, his gaze locked. A silent signal, not of threat, but intent. Clara's hand instinctively reached for his neck, brushing against the old scar beneath his fur, the one no one saw unless they looked closely. The one Clara had traced weeks ago in silence. He stayed beside her, but the message was clear. He knows. Rhodes stepped forward now, slow and deliberate, like approaching a tripwire. "Your Honor," he said, voice tight. "Permission to approach the gallery." Crowley stood suddenly. Too fast. Nervous energy crackled around him. "I need to speak with my lawyer," he muttered. But the defense attorney looked confused. "You're not on trial, Mr. Crowley," the judge said, eyes narrowing. "No," Rhodes replied softly, "but maybe he should be." At that moment, Clara turned in her chair, not in fear, not in panic, but with quiet certainty. She pointed, right at Wyatt Crowley, and said, for the first time in months, in a voice that was neither loud nor shaking, just clear. He locked the door. The room stopped breathing. Then chaos began. Security closed in. The judge barked for order. Crowley tried to move, but Vega was already ahead of him, not attacking, just blocking. Not 1 inch of fur bristled. But the message in his stance was primal and certain. "You will not move through me." Rhodes grabbed Crowley by the arm, not needing cuffs yet, just the truth. Dr. Rivers turned to Clara, eyes wide with something close to awe. But Clara didn't notice. She had buried her face into Vega's fur, holding the doll in one hand. And for the first time her shoulders shook, not with fear, but with the weight of something beginning to lift. A memory, a name, and the scent of justice. For a few seconds after the whisper, the courtroom holds its breath. The air changes. Clara's voice, so fragile, so rare a has, rippled through the silence, like a stone dropped into still water. "He smelled like this," she had said, barely audible, but caught by the lapel mic clipped to her collar. The doll, now clenched in her hand, trembles slightly. And Vega shifts. It's not dramatic. Not a snarl. Not a bark. Just a low, sustained vibration deep in his chest. A warning. Controlled. Deliberate. As if he's anchoring something unspeakable between his ribs and his instincts. His eyes, once gently scanning the room, now sharpen like the lens of a long dormant camera suddenly brought into focus. They lock unblinking onto a man in the gallery. Wyatt Crowley. He sits near the back, flanked by a lawyer who seems too confident, and a suit who looks like he's never sweated. But Wyatt sweats. Not much, but enough. A pale film blooms over his brow. His posture stiffens. His fingers dig slightly into the wooden bench as Vega's gaze pierces through the polished veneer he's worn for months. The judge, mid-sentence, halts. "You all right there, sir?" The bailiff whispers to Vega's handler, but the dog doesn't move, doesn't blink. Then he does. One calculated step forward. Not toward Wyatt, toward Clara. In a slow, deliberate move, Vega places his body between her wheelchair and the gallery. It isn't aggressive, it's protective. A silent, living shield. His ears are alert, tail stiff, stance ready. The room at once too quiet and too loud breaks into a flurry of glances, murmurs, tension pulled taut like piano wire. "Your Honor," the prosecutor stands, papers clutched to his chest, voice tighter than usual. "I'd like to request an immediate suspension of today's proceedings and submit a formal motion for forensic re-examination of Exhibit B and all case materials connected to Clara Wells' possessions." Defense tries to object, but no one really listens. The judge leans forward, visibly unsettled but composed. "On what grounds?" The prosecutor glances at Clara, then at Vega, then at the man whose face is steadily losing color. "On grounds of new testimonial behavior from the minor and behavioral evidence presented by the certified K-9 assigned to her recovery team." There's a rare, jagged moment, when a courtroom loses all the choreography of law and becomes something primal, human. Vega's growl fades. He lies back down, but his head stays locked toward the gallery. "And Clara," she breathes. It's subtle, but her chest moves in a way that's different, less shallow. Her fingers release the doll, not drop it, just let go. And that simple act, that release, echoes louder than any gavel. The judge looks down, then toward the gallery, then back. "Granted. Court is in recess. All parties, please remain available for further questioning." Chairs, scrape. Whispers build. Someone from the forensic unit is already on their phone. Another's snapping photos of the doll, now labeled not just Exhibit B, but critical evidence pending reevaluation. Wyatt stands quickly, too quickly, but the bailiff steps into his path. "Please remain seated, sir," the bailiff says, not unkindly, but not softly either. Wyatt smiles a crooked, lopsided thing and shrugs. "Just stretching my legs." But no one believes him now. Rhodes is already on the move, phone to his ear, voice low. Dr. Rivers leans toward Clara with gentle eyes. "You did something brave today," she whispers. But Clara doesn't respond. She doesn't need to. Her body speaks for her now. Vega rests his head beside her wheel, eyes never leaving the gallery. Outside the courtroom, the air tastes different, like something about to change. Mason waits by the exit, posture tense. When Clara is wheeled out by her grandmother, he glances not at her but at Vega. "He knew," Mason says softly, more to himself than anyone else. "That dog? He knew something we didn't." Rhodes catches the words, stops, then turns. "Maybe it's not just instinct," he says. "Maybe it's memory." A pause, then the faintest nod from Mason. "Or maybe it's both." Inside the evidence room, technicians begin running tests again, this time on fibers inside the doll. The scent trace Vega reacted to will be analyzed for matches. One lab tech lifts the stitching around its neck and finds, embedded deep within the seam, a tiny smudge of something that shouldn't be there. Organic. Human. Blood. Not Clara's. Outside, Vega rides in the back of the SUV, ears twitching with each sound, but calm now. Clara sits beside him, not speaking, just watching him. Then, for the first time since she arrived, she reaches out, not with the doll, not with hesitation, but with her own hand, resting it on the scar beneath his fur. No words, just touch. And Vega leans in, eyes softening. Somewhere deep in the distance, a thread that's been tangled too long begins to unravel. The forensic lab was never meant to feel like a chapel, but that morning, it might as well have been. Sterile lights hummed above cold metal tables. Machines blinked quietly, performing the silent rituals of truth-seeking mass spectrometers parsing the molecular language of ruin. At the center of it all lay the scorched remains of a child's doll, sealed in a clear evidence bag, labeled Exhibit B. Dr. Mei Lin, lead forensic analyst, adjusted her gloves with the precision of someone who knew grief could hide in residue. Her gaze lingered on the melted polyester of the doll's backwear. It had fused into itself from prolonged heat exposure, likely from a radiator or sunlit dash. But it wasn't the burn marks that made her pause. It was the smell, not the acrid char, not the sickening tang of melted synthetic. Something else. A sweet undertone, faint but present, artificial, cloying. She leaned closer, pulled back the evidence seal, and waved a metal probe just above the surface. The digital readout flickered. Eucalyptal, benzalkonium chloride, alkyl benzoate. The last one made her heart skip. She tapped the screen, zooming in. Triclosan, modified, proprietary compound. Her breath caught. "Get me the sample registry from old cases tied to janitorial supply sources," she said softly, voice steady but tight. "Look up corporate cleaning agents between 2012 and 2018. Focus on custom orders, rare blends, restricted distribution." An assistant, barely 22 and 2 months out of university, blinked in surprise. "Why?" May didn't look up. "Because this scent doesn't belong to a child's doll. It belongs to someone trying to erase something." Within the hour, the data came back slow at first, then unmistakable. The compound was a rare formulation used only by a handful of industrial cleaning contracts. Among them, ClearPath Facility Management, defunct now, absorbed in 2019 after a class action suit over illegal chemical dumping. Their janitorial kits had included the same chemical profile detected in the doll fabric. Wyatt Crowley had worked for them, a night supervisor for 18 months. Mei Lin stared at the connection on the screen dots, forming a line no one had noticed until a dog growled in a courtroom, until a girl whispered, "He smelled like this." That wasn't metaphor. That was memory. And now, chemistry was catching up to what trauma never forgot. Rhodes leaned over the forensic report in the DA's office. Rain pelted the windows behind him. The document shook slightly in his grip, not from fear, but from something heavier. A vindication that didn't feel like triumph. A puzzle piece that didn't fit, but refused to be ignored. Dr. Elaine Rivers stood beside him, her arms crossed, unreadable. This was never just about what Clara saw, she said finally. It was about what her body remembered, her senses, her nervous system. The mind protects what it must, but the body keeps the score, Rhodes finished. They both turned toward the small observation monitor, where Clara sat in the therapy room. Vega was curled beside her, his head on her feet. She was sketching again, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. A sun in the corner, her chair, a black dog with alert eyes. And in the center, the doll. Still the doll. It had never left her hand the night she was found. Fire had almost claimed it, but she hadn't let go. In a home gutted by heat and silence, she had held on to that single burning object because it held a scent. Now, that scent had a name and a timeline. The prosecutor, Angela Torres, entered briskly, file in hand. Her heels echoed across the floor as she laid the document down. I've confirmed with ClearPath's records team. Wyatt had full access to janitorial closets and cleaning agents. That blend of compound wasn't available to the public. It was custom designed for odor suppression in older buildings. Rhodes narrowed his eyes. Which means the scent on the doll couldn't have come from a store-bought product. Only from contact with someone who used or handled that compound regularly. Angela tapped the file. Someone like Wyatt Crowley. Dr. Rivers frowned. It's circumstantial, but it's cumulative. Angela cut in. It's one more layer. The whisper, the growl, the chemical trace. You add in motive and proximity, and you have enough to reopen the investigation under probable cause. Rhodes finished. Angela nodded. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, the rain blurred the city into long streaks of gray. But inside that room, clarity was forming bit by bit, like sunlight returning to a room long shuttered. Later that afternoon, Rhodes entered the therapy room. Clara didn't look up. She didn't have to. Vega lifted his head, then settled again when he saw it was Rhodes. Clara's pencil stilled. He knelt down beside her, slow, respectful. I wanted to thank you, he said quietly, for helping Vega, for helping us. You remembered something today, something only you could remember. Clara didn't speak, but her fingers brushed Vega's fur, then tightened on the doll. Do you know what this little guy told us? Rhodes continued, gesturing toward the charred fabric. He told us a secret. One we didn't know how to hear until now. Clara blinked. Once. Then again. Secrets are like smells, aren't they? He said softer. Sometimes they stay on things, long after people try to hide them. Vega shifted, his ear twitching. Clara slowly moved her doll into her lap, holding it with both hands. Then, without prompting, she spoke. Not a whisper. A word. Bathroom. Rhodes froze. What, Clara? She looked up, eyes glassy but focused. He kept the cleaning stuff in the bathroom. Rhodes turned to Dr. Rivers, who was already moving. The dam had cracked. Memory was surfacing slippery, raw, but real. And all because a scent survived fire. All because a child refused to let go. All because a dog remembered what humans could not. The lab was colder than it needed to be, not in temperature, but in silence. The hum of centrifuges, the click of gloves against glass, and the sharp scent of isopropyl filled the void. No chatter, just breath held in suspension. Rhodes stood at the observation window, arms crossed tight against his chest. Behind the reinforced glass, two technicians worked under sterile hoods, their movements precise, almost reverent. One gently lowered a small translucent tray into a sequencer unit. Inside the tray, labeled only as Item B, melted doll fragment, rested a sliver of vinyl. Warped and cloudy what remained of Clara's doll after the fire. The forensic lead, Dr. Lynn Carr, entered the room with a tablet in hand and a tension that preceded her like fog. Rhodes didn't turn. Any movement? Dr. Carr exhaled through her nose. We've got something. Not a full match, but something. That got his attention. She tapped the screen and rotated it toward him. Mitochondrial DNA. recovered from skin cells embedded in the melted plastic, likely deposited when the doll was held during prolonged stress sweat friction, maybe during the fire, maybe long before. He squinted at the data columns, trying to make sense of the strings. And she zoomed in on a cluster of sequences. We cross-checked this against CODIS, then narrowed it with rare genotypes. The profile we pulled, it's almost extinct, present in less than 0.02% of the population, an anomaly. A beat passed, then another. Rhodes looked up, eyes narrowing. "Are you saying we ran it against Wyatt Crowley's DNA?" she said quietly. "From the employment medical records we subpoenaed. And partial match, but significant enough to confirm presence." Her voice dropped lower. "Statistically, the chance of a random individual matching this profile is less than 1 in 8 million. Rhodes felt his chest tighten, not with relief, not yet, but with vindication pressing at the edges of disbelief. "So his DNA was on the doll?" "Yes." "In the vinyl?" "Yes." "And the match?" She nodded. "Belongs to Wyatt Crowley." He stared at the tablet, as if it might change its mind. "We have him." She didn't smile. "We have the beginning of him." It was just past 3 a.m. when Rhodes sat in his car outside the Winters residence. The dashboard clock blinked quietly in red, a pulse in the dark. He hadn't called ahead. Couldn't. Not for this. Through the bay window, a warm glow spilled into the quiet street. Inside, Clara sat cross-legged on the rug. Her hands worked gently over a new piece of sketch paper. Beside her, Vega lay curled, not asleep, but watching. The doll, now fully returned to her, rested on a folded cloth near the hearth. It wasn't melted anymore. At least, not to her. Rhodes stepped out of the car and approached slowly. He tapped once against the door. It opened before he knocked again. Miriam Winters stood wrapped in a cardigan, eyes rimmed red but alert. She looked past him, as though searching his face for a verdict before words could fail or betray. He offered the tablet. She didn't take it. "Is it enough?" Rhodes's voice was steady. "We can place Wyatt's DNA inside the melted plastic. There's no reason for it to be there, none that an innocent man can offer." She looked back over her shoulder toward Clara. The girl hadn't noticed. Or maybe she had, but didn't feel the need to flinch anymore. "Will they charge him?" she asked. "With this and the chemical trace," Rhodes nodded. "They'll move forward." Miriam let her breath out in a long, trembling line. "She'll need to know." "She already does," he said softly. The courtroom was full again, but the air had changed. No longer anticipation. It was reckoning. Wyatt Crowley sat at the defense table, his fingers twitching against his lap. He stared down, unmoving, as the prosecutor presented the evidence before the judge. The synthetic deodorizer compound, the mitochondrial DNA match, the lab-certified images of vinyl melting at temperatures consistent with accelerant use. The doll had been the key. But Vega had been the guardian. In the gallery, Vega sat beside Clara. His eyes never moved from Wyatt. Every shift of the man's body registered a twitch, a tap, a glance. Vega felt it all. And Clara, now without her mic, leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap. The doll rested beside her. She didn't need to say anything, because her silence had become a language, a memory, a map, and someone had finally listened. That evening, as the news spread slow and cautious, like thawing ground, Clara drew another picture. This one was different. She handed it to her grandmother without ceremony. A crayon sketch. A figure in a wheelchair. A figure beside her four-legged, bold. In the corner, a rising sun, and beneath it, in shaky but determined letters, "He remembers too." Miriam held the paper in shaking hands. "Who, Clara?" she whispered. Clara looked up, and for the first time, her voice didn't break. "Vega." The courtroom had long since grown used to the rhythm of silence. But when the door opened that morning and a man with a stooped gait stepped inside, leaning on a weathered cane, the quiet shifted. Gregory Holloway, 72, retired postman of East Haven, was not the kind of man who liked attention. His corduroy jacket looked a size too big, the color sun-faded, and his voice had the rasp of someone who once smoked too long but quit too late. Yet there was something in the way he paused at the stand, gazing across the room as though trying to place himself in a memory he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Please raise your right hand." He did. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," he said, voice dry as old leaves. Assistant D.A. Keller rose. "Mr. Holloway, we understand you have a statement regarding the night of the fire, the 4th of September, last year?" Greg gave a single nod. "I was walking my route, not delivering, not officially. I do that sometimes. Habit. Muscle memory's hard to break when you've walked the same loop for 38 years. His tone wasn't defensive, just matter of fact. People in the gallery leaned in. Even Judge Whitmore sat a little straighter. "I came up behind the alleyway on the north side of Amber Street. The air smelled like burnt plastic and rain. Wasn't storming yet, but the pressure was dropping. I remember that." He paused, swallowed. "That's when I saw a man. Tall, broad-shouldered. Looked like he'd just come from the back of the McAllister house. Gasps didn't break the room, but breaths held." Keller took a cautious step forward. "And you saw this man clearly?" Greg hesitated, then said, "He saw me first. That turned heads. I startled him," Greg continued. "He spun around fast, looked right at me. His face was in shadow, but I saw his eyes, pale, angry." Keller glanced briefly at Wyatt Crowley, whose complexion had turned the color of chalk. "What happened next?" "He said something. 'What the hell are you doing here?' Real aggressive, like I was the intruder. But I knew him. Delivered his mother's mail for years when he was a boy. Didn't recognize me, I think, or didn't care. Do you remember his voice, Mr. Holloway?" Greg nodded slowly. "Clear as day. Same voice that used to holler from the porch when the mail was late. Wyatt Crowley." Defense objected, of course. Conjecture. Elderly witness. Lighting compromised. But Greg simply reached into his pocket and unfolded a small piece of paper. "I didn't come here with memory alone," he said, gaze steady. "That night, after I saw him, I made a note. I do that. Always have. Got notebooks full of them. Because when you see something strange and ignore it, it comes back and bites you." He handed the note to Keller, who passed it to the judge. The timestamp read, "The 4th of September, 9:43 p.m. Man in alley. Looks like Crowley boy. Nervous. Said something angry. Why there?" Silence swallowed the room. Even Vega, curled beside Clara in her seat, was still. But Clara herself looked on with wide, alert eyes. No longer the disassociated child floating above the trial. This was her world, her moment, returning in fragments. "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" the defense pressed, desperate. Greg's voice didn't rise. "I didn't know it mattered. I heard a fire broke out. Yes, but no one said it was intentional. By the time the town started whispering about foul play, months had passed. I'm just a mailman, son. I figured someone smarter would piece things together." The judge intervened before any more questions could fray the dignity of Greg's presence. He was thanked and gently excused. But his words had cracked something open. In the hallway afterward, Greg walked past Clara. She looked up at him, this man who had seen something no one else had, who had chosen to speak. "I remember your truck," she said quietly. "It had a dent on the door, shaped like a sunflower." Greg blinked. "That it did?" he whispered, then touched his brow as though tipping a hat he hadn't worn in decades. Back inside the courtroom, Wyatt fidgeted. The pieces were no longer scattered, they were converging. DNA, chemical residue, an eyewitness from the edge of obscurity. The defense looked pale, buried beneath evidence they couldn't swat away with words. But the truest thing came not from the evidence, nor the transcripts. It came from Vega. He had not growled again. He had not needed to. But the way he stood between Clara and the man who had once brought smoke into her life was a kind of silent closing argument. No lawyer could contest it. And Clara, holding the melted doll to her lap, whispered something again. Not for the mic, not for the record. But Vega heard, and that was enough. There was no dramatic music in a real courtroom, no gavel pounding for silence, only breathsome held, some broken, some trembling just under the surface. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead as District Attorney Melinda Graves stood, papers in hand, voice steady as stone. The courtroom was packed, but a hush sat over it like snow. Every eye flicked to the defense table where Wyatt Crowley sat, his shirt too stiff, his fingers twitching against his thigh. But Clara, Clara was still. Her small frame rested in her chair, her hand gently curled in Vega's fur. The German shepherd didn't move either. He was stone beside her, watching. D.A. Graves cleared her throat and began. "Members of the grand jury," she said, pacing slowly, "we ask you to consider not just evidence, but silence, not just data, but instinct, and not just facts, but a child's life." She paused to let her words settle. "Exhibit B," she gestured, "is not just a melted vinyl doll. It is a carrier of memory. Memory embedded in scent, in chemical residue, in skin. And that memory tells us a story." Clara didn't blink. Her hands were steady now. The courtroom had become something more than a chamber of justice. It had become a container of breath held for too long. "We found chemical traces in the fibers of the doll compounds not available commercially, but common in a specific type of janitorial cleaning supply. The very kind used at the Beachmont Industrial Complex, where Mr. Crowley was employed until 6 months before the fire." Wyatt looked up sharply. His face betrayed a flicker of something he hadn't shown before. "Fear and DNA," Graves continued. "Mitochondrial, embedded in melted plastic. Skin flakes, likely shed during contact. A partial match to less than 0.02% of the population. But one man in this room shares that genetic fingerprint. Mr. Crowley, you are that match." A murmur rippled across the gallery. A handkerchief dropped to the floor. Someone gasped. Clara didn't react, but Vega did. A slow shift in weight, ears upright, as if awaiting the next move. Graves turned, her voice lowering. "But DNA and chemicals alone aren't enough. Not to you, not to this child. So let me show you the thread that stitches this together." She pressed a remote. The screen behind her came to life. Surveillance stills, receipts, timestamps. An old man, thin, gray-jacketed, standing beside a witness chair. "This," she said, "is Greg Holloway, a retired postal worker. He came forward after seeing a news report of this trial." Greg, seated in the witness stand earlier that week, had shared what he'd seen on the night of the fire. A man standing in the alley, smoke, the stench of fuel. A curse barked in surprise when spotted. He hadn't known who the man was then. But he did now. "Mr. Holloway identified Mr. Crowley without hesitation," Graves said, "and his testimony places him at the scene before emergency calls were even made." Wyatt's hand twitched again. This time, it didn't stop. "And why?" Graves turned sharply, her voice rising only slightly, like a violin string pulled taut. "Why would a man return to the scene? Why would he risk being seen?" She let the pause hold, then answered herself. "To make sure the fire did what it was meant to do." Across the aisle, Clara's eyes were focused, not on the screen, not on Wyatt, but on Vega. Her fingers moved slowly down his spine, grounding herself with each gentle stroke. And Vega, in return, kept his eyes fixed not on Clara, but on Wyatt Crowley. Watching, unmoving. Graves leaned closer to the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not about probability. This is about convergence. Scent, DNA, motive, timeline, witness, and this child," she pointed gently to Clara, "was never meant to live through that fire." Whispers broke out. The judge didn't silence them. Wyatt's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Wyatt himself slumped. A slow collapse inward. His chin trembled. His shoulders buckled like metal giving under heat. The judge's voice was calm, but final. "Mr. Crowley, you are hereby indicted on charges of arson with intent to kill, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice." Wyatt didn't lift his head. The courtroom didn't erupt. It deflated, like a held breath finally exhaled. Vega stood. No bark, no growl. Just a stance of calm authority, as if the truth had finally stood up with him. Clara reached and rested her hand on his shoulder, and for the first time since the fire, her lips parted in something resembling peace. A juror wiped a tear. Greg Holloway watched her from the back row and silently pressed his cap to his chest. Outside, the autumn sun was beginning to drop, casting long shadows through the stained glass panels. A single beam caught Vega's fur as he turned toward the door with Clara beside him. And for a brief moment, it looked like justice had a shape. Not a gavel, Not a badge, but a dog, and a girl who refused to be erased. The courtroom was so quiet. Even the breath of the ceiling fans seemed intrusive. Judge Miriam Hollis adjusted her glasses with a hand that betrayed none of the emotion behind her eyes. Her gavel rested just inches from her fingers, unmoved, as if it too was waiting, holding its breath like everyone else. Beside the bench, a clerk handed her the final document, a warrant, fresh ink, weighted with everything the room could not say out loud. She scanned the text. Then she looked up, her voice clear, precise, but softened by something that felt maternal. "Wyatt Crowley," she said, each syllable striking the air like a clock chime. "This court finds sufficient grounds to issue a formal indictment on charges of first-degree arson, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice." There was no gasp, no dramatic outburst. Not this time. Wyatt sat there in the defendant's chair body slack, eyes hollow. His hands trembled slightly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The sweat along his hairline had dried into salt. For all his earlier smirks and sarcastic eye rolls, he looked now like a man who had already been sentenced by something older than the court, older than law, maybe conscience. 2 bailiffs approached, but he didn't flinch. No shackles were needed. His shoulders drooped in quiet surrender. He stood slowly, spine bowed, and held out his wrists. The moment was strangely quiet-like. A tired man checking in for something inevitable. Behind him, in the front row of the gallery, Clara sat perfectly upright in her wheelchair. Her hands rested gently on the curve of Vega's back, fingertips nestled in fur. Her pale knuckles relaxed, not clenched. No fear in her gaze only, the steady look of someone who had survived something worse than monsters. Vega didn't move. His body was still, alert but at ease, his eyes tracking every moment without tension. The German shepherd's ears flicked only once, when Wyatt's boots scuffed against the polished floor. One of the bailiffs hesitated, perhaps expecting protest. Wyatt said nothing. He didn't plead, didn't spit curses or cry foul. He didn't even meet Clara's eyes. Instead, he looked at the courtroom exit like a man seeing the sea for the last time before a long walk into the desert. Clara watched him, not with triumph but with that same quiet understanding she'd carried through every phase of the trial. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need to scream. She had Vega. She had truth. And she had her breath, her life back. Judge Hollis signed the final page of the warrant with a long exhale. "Let the record reflect," she said firmly, "that justice was sought and found." Oh, the stenographer's fingers danced rapidly across the keys, capturing it all in a language made of silence and letters. Wyatt was led away. Outside the courthouse, a light breeze stirred the flags on the lawn. Reporters clustered near the steps like vultures circling. But inside, no one moved yet. The courtroom held on to the moment, cradling it like a fragile glass. Clara leaned slightly forward. Her hand dropped to Vega's collar, and for the first time that day, she smiled barely. It wasn't the smile of a victor. It was the soft, weary smile of someone who made it through a storm without losing the center of herself. She whispered something into Vega's ear. He tilted his head, then rose gently to all fours, brushing his shoulder against her leg like an anchor. They were ready to leave. The prosecutor, a woman named Melina Cruz, watched them from across the aisle, her eyes glassy but strong. She didn't approach Clara, didn't need to. A single nod passed between them 2 warriors, acknowledging a shared trench. The jury was dismissed with thanks and caution. Some of them lingered longer than necessary. A few looked toward Clara. One older man removed his glasses and wiped at his eyes. And then the room emptied. Clara and Vega were the last to move. A bailiff held the door open. As her wheelchair turned, the soft glow of morning light reached her face through the high windows no longer filtered by smoke or shame. She didn't look back. The hallway just outside the courtroom was narrow and dimly lit, like the afterthought of a building that had seen too many endings. Muted sounds echoed from distant rooms, paper shuffling, a door latching shut, someone coughing down the corridor. But here, just beyond the reach of microphones and verdicts, there was only silence. A living silence, heavy and soft, like snowfall over a scarred battlefield. Clara's wheelchair came to a gentle stop beneath a flickering exit sign. She didn't ask for anyone to wait. She just stopped. The wheels gave a soft creak, as if they too understood the weight of the moment. Vega sat beside her, close but not pressed. His ears were relaxed now, his breath deep and even. The tension he had carried for weeks, the unspoken vigilance of a dog who knew his person had been under threat, was finally beginning to drain from his frame. He had been her shield, her compass, her voice when she had none. Now he waited. Clara looked down at him not just with affection, but with something deeper, something sacred. A step behind them, Dr. Rivers stood still, her hands folded in front of her, heart visible in her throat. She knew she was witnessing something rare, a threshold not of justice, but of healing. Clara turned slightly. Her fingers brushed Vega's neck. She took a breath, then another. And then, for the first time since the fire, since the trial, since the terror and the silence that had walled her off from the world, Clara spoke. Soft, so soft that it might have been missed entirely, if not for the way it pierced the stillness like the first crack of dawn after a long black night. Vega. Just his name. But it was everything. The sound trembled not from fear, but from unfamiliar use, like a violin string retuned after years in the dark. Her voice didn't ring out. It unfolded, careful and tender. Fragile, but undeniably alive. And Vega heard. He lifted his head slowly, turning those deep, intelligent eyes to her with a kind of understanding that could never be tauntingly earned. His tail gave a single, quiet thump against the floor. Once. That was all. But that one motion, subtle and sure, carried the weight of a lifetime. It was a, yes, I'm here, I heard you. Clara's eyes blinked fast. Her lips parted slightly, as if the word had surprised even her. She reached down again, this time pressing her whole hand against Vega's chest. Her palm rested over his heart. I missed saying your name, she whispered, though that part was for her, not for anyone else. Dr. Rivers took a step forward and stopped. She tried to clear her throat, but the tears came anyway, not loud, not disruptive, just the kind of tears that happen when the world shifts in a quiet, sacred way and you're lucky enough to witness it. You said it, she murmured. Clara nodded once, her face flushing with the kind of warmth that no medication could mimic. I did. Dr. Rivers came closer, kneeling down gently so she was eye level with Vega. She stroked his ear, her hand trembling. That's the real sentence, she said softly, speaking more to herself than anyone else. Not the one the judge gave. This is it. This is what was stolen from you, and this is what you took back. The air felt thick with grace. No cameras. No clapping. No headlines. Just a girl, her dog, a doctor, and a moment that rewrote the rules of what it meant to heal. Clara took another breath. I didn't think I'd ever speak again, she said, stronger now. Not because I couldn't, because I was afraid it wouldn't be mine. Dr. Rivers placed her hand over Clara's. And now? Clara looked down at Vega. I remember now, she said. My voice belongs to me. The hallway stretched on in both directions, empty as a chapel after prayers. But in that quiet space, a resurrection had occurred. Not of a miracle, but of a truth. Some wounds do not silence us. They teach us the worth of sound. Vega shifted just slightly closer, not because she asked, just because he could. Dr. Rivers smiled through the blur in her eyes. You gave it back to her, didn't you? She whispered to Vega. The dog didn't move again. He didn't have to. The sentence had already been served. And the verdict this one, the truest one, was life. The room was small, barely wider than the chief's office, and yet it held a silence as reverent as any cathedral. No press, no live stream, just a few chairs, the faint scent of polished wood, and the soft hum of an air vent that carried decades of stories through the bones of the precinct. Vega sat still in the front row, his ears gently alert, gaze steady. His coat had been brushed that morning not for vanity, but out of respect. Around his neck hung an old, worn leather collar. Its tag was faded, its stitching frayed, but it bore a name that still lived in the air like a sacred echo. Keller. Clara sat beside Vega in her wheelchair, her hand loosely resting on his back. No one asked her to speak. No one needed to. Her present shoulders held high, lips relaxed in a quiet smile said more than any words could. To her left, Doctor. Rivers stood in civilian clothes, arms folded softly. A woman who had witnessed the worst of what silence could do. And now she was seeing what it could restore. The room held only a handful of officers. Those who knew, those who stayed. Those who hadn't forgotten Sergeant Jonah Keller or the dog he'd trained with his heart, not just his hands. At the far end, Chief Lawrence stepped forward. His uniform was pressed, but his voice wasn't. When he cleared his throat, it wasn't to command attention. It was to brace himself. He looked down at the plaque in his hands. The metal rested on a deep velvet cushion silver, round, its surface etched with the emblem of the department. But what made it different, what made it real, was the inscription beneath. Medal of Silent Valor, for bravery beyond words. Chief Lawrence's voice was quiet when he began. "We don't give this often," he said. "Some would say we shouldn't give it at all to a dog." There was a ripple of silence. Not resistance, just gravity, the chief continued. But then again, some would say that what Vega did these past months wasn't just brave, it was human. He looked toward Vega. This dog didn't chase down suspects or sniff out bombs. He did something harder. He stayed. He bore witness. He carried a child through fire, then stood by her while the world tried to silence her. And in the end, he gave voice to the voiceless. Clara blinked hard. Her grip on Vega's fur tightened for just a moment, then softened. Chief Lawrence came forward, kneeling slightly not in submission, but in honor. He held the plaque close. "In memory of his handler, Sergeant Jonah Keller," he said quietly, "and in gratitude for his continued service to this community. Vega, we present you with the Medal of Silent Valor." There was no applause, only breath. Vega didn't flinch. He didn't bark or move, but his eyes flicked toward Clara, then the chief, then back again. He understood something had changed. Not a rank, not a duty, a recognition. The chief placed the plaque gently before him, careful not to invade space, and then, with more reverence than formality, he reached toward Vega's neck and touched the worn collar. "Your old man would have been proud," the chief whispered. Someone exhaled softly in the back of the room. Clara leaned down, her forehead resting gently against Vega's. No words, just that. That still, perfect moment where one soul steadied another. The tag on Vega's collar shifted slightly, catching a sliver of afternoon light filtering through the blinds. For a second, it gleamed not like a medal, but like memory. Dr. Rivers stepped forward, holding a folded slip of paper. "If I may," she said. The chief nodded. She opened the note and began reading, not as a speech, but as something closer to a eulogy wrapped in hope. There are kinds of courage that cannot be taught, only endured. There are wounds that can't be stitched, only witnessed. Vega did not act to be honored. He did not stay for reward. He stayed because loyalty is a language older than fear and stronger than death. The room seemed to still further, as if the air itself was bowing. Dr. Rivers folded the note. "And so, we honor him not as a dog, but as what he is, a guardian." She stepped back, her hands now trembling. Chief Lawrence placed a hand over his badge. "This ceremony is unofficial," he said softly. But so was Jonah's last act. He threw himself in front of a bullet for someone else's child. And Vega, well, he did the same, just slower, over time, over silence. Clara brushed her fingers across the plaque. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't clear who she meant. Maybe everyone. Maybe just one soul who wasn't there to hear it. Vega's tail gave a slow, respectful wag. Outside, a car passed with a low hum. Life continued. But in this small, windowless room at the heart of the precinct, something sacred had been stitched back into the fabric of what justice meant. No cameras, no articles, just truth. And a collar that once belonged to a fallen officer, now sitting still, beating with his legacy. The sky above the garden was the color of clean linen, soft, cloud-fringed, and new. It was the kind of morning that didn't ask for anything except presence. Dew still clung to the edges of grass blades, making the world shimmer. Somewhere in the distance, birds debated their melodies, unhurried. In this sliver of quiet, Clara stood beneath the maple tree. She was barefoot, her soles damp with earth, and the sleeves of her shirt pushed to her elbows as if ready for something that required effort. But there was no resistance here. Just Time's low, kind, and without threat. Vega sat a few feet away, his coat catching the light in patches of bronze and gray. He watched her like he always did, not out of duty, but a patient, grounded loyalty. His ears flicked with the wind. His breathing was soft, steady, like a presence older than trauma. He belonged here, as much as the tree, as much as the girl. Clara looked up from her sketchpad. A faint breeze tugged at her bangs, and for a moment, she seemed to listen to the rustling leaves, or maybe the silence within herself. Then, she smiled. It wasn't the cautious curve of relief. It wasn't the polite mimicry she had worn in the weeks after the courtroom. This one was real wide, crooked, full of gaps where baby teeth had once lived. It lit her face in a way that no therapy room ever could. She bent down, fingers brushing across colored pencils like old friends. She chose green, drew sweeping arc trees, round and friendly, then brown, a swing, drawn with uneven ropes, swaying. Then yellow for windows, always glowing. Every page of her new sketchbook had the same house, safe, lit from within. Dr. Rivers watched from the porch steps, coffee cooling in her hands. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Healing doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it comes as crayons pressed against paper, as the deliberate coloring of a roofline, or in the way a little girl no longer flinched when birds startled from the trees. Clara stood suddenly. Her legs were still wobbly from the stiffness that had come with months of muteness, but she didn't care. She was running, if you could call it, that arms stretched outward, like she could catch the wind. "Vega!" she called. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The name left her lips like breath warmed by the sun. Clear, purposeful, her voice a thread returned. Vega stood, his tail lifting, ears pricking at attention. And as Clara reached him, he dipped his head and nudged into her ribs with a softness that brought her giggles tumbling out like marbles from a jar. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around his neck. Not with desperation, not to hide, but with joy raw, unmistakable, childlike joy. She pressed her cheek to his fur, whispered something only he could hear, and he answered not with words, but with the slow thump of his tail in the grass, his breath hot and steady at her temple. Across the garden, the wind moved through tall sunflowers, brushing the fence posts like a blessing. Clara's sketchpad lay open behind her. On the page, she had drawn something new today. A dog. Right beside the glowing house, beneath a swing, there he stood loyal and still, his fur drawn with too many colors, his eyes too large for scale. But it was him. It was Vega. And above them, she had drawn a sun. When Dr. Rivers joined them, she knelt beside the two of them. Vega shifted to accommodate her without moving away from Clara. The girl was talking now, not a flood, not yet, but words came, little ones. "He sleeps by my window. He's not scared of storms. He looks at me like I'm real." "You are real," Dr. Rivers said gently. Clara's eyes lifted to meet hers, solemn and knowing in a way only children who've been through fire can be. "I wasn't before." The therapist reached out, brushing a leaf from Clara's shoulder. "Yes, you were. But now, you believe it." That evening, Clara asked if she could plant something in the garden. "Something that grows even after fire," she said. They chose marigolds. Their roots took to the soil easily, as if they remembered something from long ago. Clara dug with her hands, dirt under her fingernails, grinning when a worm wiggled through her palm. Vega lay nearby, watching with the contentment of someone who had finally done what he was made to do. When the last flower was planted, Clara whispered, "For Mom." Then a pause. "And for Vega, because he didn't leave." No one corrected her. No one told her Vega was just a dog. No one told her how lucky she was. Because in that garden, in the hush between words and recovery, truth didn't need grammar. It just needed space. And it had finally found it. The first warmth of spring bled through the curtains like soft watercolor. Morning crept into the room at its own pace, no longer rushed or shivering with old dread. In the sunlit quiet, Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by paper, crayons, and the faint scent of lavender from Dr. Rivers' diffuser. Her brow furrowed not in fear, not in sadness, but in focus. Each movement of her hand across the page was slow and deliberate. The crayon's waxy edge scraped gently as green curved into grass, sky stretched open in robin's egg blue, and the yellow of the sunbright and round spilled from the top corner like it belonged again. Vega rested a few feet away, sprawled on the rug with his head between his paws. His eyes tracked her, steady and patient, like they always had. No commands, no tension, just a kind of presence that filled the room like a heartbeat. When Clara glanced at him, he blinked once. Slow. She smiled. The paper grew colorful. In the center of the drawing, she had sketched herself. Brown hair, pink dress, arms outstretched. Next to her was Vega, not in armor or vest, but soft and relaxed, his tail mid-wag. Beside him a small, delicate figure, a doll. But not melted, not broken. The same doll she had clutched the night of the fire, now drawn intact. Clara had even colored in its button eyes with glints of light. A silent survivor. And this time, there was someone else. Behind the girl and the doll stood a boy, taller, wearing a red hoodie and holding a balloon on a string. The balloon floated high, stretching off the top edge of the page. She'd drawn a smile on his face. It wasn't a memory, not exactly, but it was something deeper, something remembered in the soul before the mind could catch up. Mateo, her brother. Dr. Rivers noticed it first. She approached quietly, kneeling at Clara's side. "May I see?" she asked gently. Clara nodded. The therapist studied the page for a long moment, her hand going instinctively to her heart. She said nothing at first, not wanting to break the quiet reverence in the air, but her throat tightened. "She included him," Rivers whispered. She remembered him in light. Clara looked up. "He was always light," she said. Her voice was fragile but clear, like glass kissed into song. Tears gathered at the corners of Rivers' eyes, but she held them back with the kind of grace only years of witnessing brokenness and healing could teach. She reached over, resting her palm lightly on Vega's back. The dog didn't move, but a soft thump of his tail answered. Later that afternoon, Clara insisted they hang the drawing on the wall beside the others. It joined a gallery of her quiet victories. A swing tied to a tree, a window with curtains and yellow light inside, a garden full of birds with uneven wings. And now, this one, the sun, the dog, the doll, the boy with the balloon. The room felt fuller, brighter. Even the shadows seemed warmer. Clara didn't ask to revisit the past that day. She didn't talk about the fire, or Wyatt Crowley, or the long hallway where she first spoke Vega's name aloud. Instead, she sat in the garden with her shoes off, feet pressed into the earth, and began to hum a tune Vega seemed to recognize. He sat upright, ears perked. "Come here, boy," she said, arms open wide. Vega bounded toward her, not fast, not wild, but with the same grace and certainty as when he had leapt between her and the flames months ago. He reached her, lowered his head, and she threw her arms around his neck. Her laugh was soft, and for the first time, it echoed. "Doctor." Rivers watched from the porch, arms crossed gently over her chest. She wasn't taking notes. She wasn't marking progress on a chart. She was simply witnessing a truth rarely given words, that some healing is so quiet, so complete, it moves like the tide, subtle, inevitable, unstoppable. Clara whispered something to Vega. He lay down beside her, nose resting on her knee. Inside, on a small corkboard near Dr. Rivers' desk, was a sticky note she'd written in her own handwriting weeks ago when Clara first arrived. There's no timeline for coming back from silence. But as she looked out the window now, she realized something deeper. Clara wasn't just returning from silence. She was choosing her own language. That evening, as golden hour stretched its final breath across the sky, Clara stood in front of the window, watching the garden turn amber. She reached for a blank sheet of paper and a crayon. Red this time. She began to draw a balloon. One single red balloon, floating up. No string, no tether, just drifting. Dr. Rivers stepped into the room. "Are you sending it somewhere?" she asked softly. Clara didn't turn around. "To Mateo," she said. "He can fly now." Rivers smiled and nodded. Clara taped the drawing on the window pane. For a second, it caught the last of the sun, glowing so bright it looked real. And as the sky turned from gold to violet, Vega let out a soft, contented sigh. In the room behind them, the doll lay on the bookshelf. No longer a symbol of fear. Just a doll again. And the sun had come back. The morning light spilled across the precinct lawn like a hush after a storm. Detective Rhodes stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the photo pinned above his desk. Major, his old canine partner. Tongue out, eyes sharp. A medal of valor barely visible around his neck. The photo had curled at the edges, but its weight had only grown. Mason Hale stood beside him, arms folded. But his eyes weren't on the past. They were on what could come next. Outside, Vega sat beside Clara on the lawn, a yellow ribbon braided into his collar. He didn't move unless she did. A silent contract. She doesn't flinch when he barks, Mason said. She doesn't scream at night anymore. He became her tether, Rhodes replied. No, her translator, Mason corrected. You and I know what it's like when language fails. Sometimes from grief, sometimes guilt, sometimes just surviving something that should have killed you. Vega didn't need words. Rhodes's gaze lingered on Vega. Major was like that. Too soft, they said. Could find a hidden child by heartbeat, but refused to bite a decoy sleeve. How many did he pull from tornado rubble? 13, Rhodes said quietly. 13. Mason let the silence settle. Then, what if there's a way to turn that kind of softness into service? You're thinking bigger than Vega and Clara. I'm thinking legacy, Mason said. About the K9S rejected for being too emotionally reactive. What if we stopped calling that failure and started calling it potential? He laid a folder on the desk. Notes from Dr. Rivers, trauma counselors, even Clara's therapist. At the top, the Vega Pact. The first page showed Vega lying beside Clara during early therapy. Her hand clutched his fur like a lifeline. The caption, a new kind of partnership between those who have survived and those trained to listen. Vega's retired, Rhodes murmured. He is, Mason said, but his mission doesn't have to be. Down the hall, Clara laughed. Vega had stolen her chalk again. Dr. Rivers followed with a camera and a smile so tender it almost broke the room. We start small, Mason said. Pair one K9 with one child. Focus on the ones the system can't reach. And the dogs? The discarded ones. The too gentle. The ones that flinch when a child cries. Rhodes stared at Major's photo. They said he wasn't fit, but he was never meant to be a weapon. He was a guardian. So let's change what we expect from guardians. Rhodes sat down, opened the folder, and under the Vega Pact, he began to write. The press release was quiet. No cameras. Just a garden gathering where Clara once drew in chalk. Vega lay at the center, wearing a new collar, soft leather, silver tag. Vega, Unit 1. Beside him sat Mira, a girl who hadn't spoken since the fire that took her brother. Now she fed Vega apple slices. He nuzzled her like he'd known her forever. Mason stepped forward. We're not here to celebrate what was lost. We're here because a dog reminded us. Silence isn't absence. Wounds don't always look like wounds. And sometimes, the gentlest heart is the strongest in the room. Rhodes added, this program begins with Vega, but it lives because of Major, and it will continue for every child learning to feel safe again. Clara stood, her shirt red. I'm not broken. I'm growing. She kissed Vega's head. Sunlight caught them in profile, girl and dog, wound and healing, beginning and legacy. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They called it the Vega Pact, now not an idea scrawled in grief, but a living movement anchored in hope. Morning News ran the story with reverence. From K9 to Healing Companion, Vega's second mission. Footage showed Vega beside Clara in a park, wind teasing his fur, calm, as if he knew exactly why he was there. Behind the camera, Dr. Rivers quietly wiped her eyes. Donations surged. A GoFundMe hit 50,000 in 2 days. Letters poured in crayon, pencil, messy, cursive. Can I meet Vega? I lost my brother too. I don't like people, but maybe a dog is okay. One letter was just a drawing. A dog with big ears under a yellow sun. The city council endorsed the program. Vega received a silver badge, his silhouette etched at center, beneath one line. For the voiceless, I stood still. Clara was there when it was pinned. Her fingers traced the badge. Vega's tail wagged once. That was enough. The first group of children came that week. In a quiet, fenced yard, Vega walked beside Clara, who now wore sunflower clips. They didn't rehearse. They were the lesson. 3 children waited near a shaded bench. One girl wouldn't lift her head. A boy clutched a dinosaur like a lifeline. The third, Avery, stood stiff, panic in her posture. Then she saw Vega. He didn't bark, didn't rush, just looked. He sat, tilted his head. An invitation. Avery blinked, took a step, then another. Her eyes never left him. She reached toward his fur and paused. Vega didn't move. Clara stepped beside her. "It's okay," she whispered. 2 words she once drew, instead of spoke. Avery touched Vega. His tail tapped the grass. The boy with the dinosaur giggled. Vega had flopped onto his back for belly rubs. Pure, undignified joy. No force, just presence, just patience. Inside, photos were printed and pinned to a board beneath Mason's handwritten quote, "We don't train them to forget. We show them who stays, even when the world goes quiet." Later, Vega curled on a mat while the kids painted. One drew a hill, another, a blue dog. Clara sketched Vega beside a house with a swing and a tiny balloon floating above. Dr. Rivers asked, "That's a nice house." Clara smiled. "It's not real yet, but it will be." One parent lingered at the gate, whispering to Mason, "She hasn't smiled since the fire, until today." By week's end, 5 dogs were paired with 7 children. Every dog had been rejected from traditional canine work for being too emotional. Now those same instincts, once liabilities, were lifelines. The press called it a miracle by paw print, but those close knew better. It wasn't magic, it was listening. A van pulled up to the training field, no sirens, just gravel under slow tires. Mason stood by the gate, one hand resting on Vega's back. The first dog out was Ash, one clouded eye, scar across his nose. He stepped off the ramp like someone testing if freedom was real. Then Bramble. Her paw had been amputated in a raid years ago. She charged down the ramp, barked into the trees like they owed her an answer. And Ghost younger, thin, eyes like firecrackers. He didn't move until the handler's palm touched his shoulder. Mason let them roam. There were no kennels here, no leashes, just shade, water, a kiddie pool. Vega nudged a metal bowl toward Ash, then lay beside Mason. "They're not broken," Mason had said. "They're just waiting for someone to stop expecting them to be perfect." That afternoon, Clara arrived. Taller now, not in height, but in posture. She didn't wait at the gate, just walked in, knelt in the field. No words, no coaxing. And the dogs came to her, one by one. Not commanded, just drawn by quiet, by knowing. Ash sat beside her first. Then Bramble leaned her weight against Clara's knee. Ghost lingered longest. But eventually, he came too. Mason watched from the shade, and for the first time since Vega's arrival, he knew. This wasn't a program. It was a promise. Just stillness. Ash was the first to approach. His head lowered, tail unsure. Clara didn't reach for him. She waited until he nudged her knee with his snout, and only then did her hand move, slow as a leaf falling in spring. "Hi," she whispered. Bramble circled wide, then closer still until her head was tucked under Clara's elbow like it belonged there. Clara laughed. Not loud, but not hidden. Ghost stood yards away, watching. Muscles coiled like a question never asked. Clara didn't look at him directly. She just placed a worn tennis ball in the dirt, stood, and walked backward, still not looking. Minutes passed. Ghost didn't move. Then he did. First, a step. Then, another. He didn't run. He didn't bark. But he reached the ball. Sniffed it. Saturday beside it, chest heaving. Vega finally approached him not head-on, but in an arc, the way dogs greet those unsure of the world. They stood a foot apart. Vega didn't assert. He acknowledged. And Ghost let out a small sound. Not a growl, not a whine. Something in between. It was enough. Later, Clara sat beside Mason on the porch steps, drinking cold lemonade. Her hair was tangled from the wind. Her jeans had a paw print in dried mud across the thigh. She didn't wipe it off. "Will they get adopted?" she asked. Mason shook his head. "Number, they'll get chosen." Clara nodded, as if she already knew that difference. She turned her sketchbook over and began to draw not a house this time, not a swing set or a sun, but a pack. Vega in the center, Ash with his good eye looking forward, Bramble, her missing paw drawn proudly, Ghost-Toff Shadow, half-light, and 3 smaller figures kid-gently connected by leashless threads of trust. Clara shaded Vega's silhouette last. Then she wrote one word above them all, in bold block letters, family. Mason swallowed hard. That's a good name, he said. Clara looked at him, then back at the field where the dogs now rested, tired but calm. No, she replied. It's just the truth. The van's engine clicked as it cooled. The sun slipped behind a patchy sky, wind stirring the field outside the Vega Pack Center. A banner waved over the gate. Second chances start here. Eli stepped out. He didn't speak or look up, arms folded tight across his chest like a shield. His skin was pale, hair flaxen and unmoved. The hoodie swallowed him. He had no backpack, no bag. What he carried couldn't be seen, but it was heavy. On the porch, Mason Ward watched. He didn't call out. Healing didn't start with words, Sid, started with presence. Beside him, Vega sat in his silver-badged harness, alert but still. His instincts told him this child didn't need affection, he needed space. Clara stood just inside the doorway, clipboard forgotten. She watched the shape of Eli's stillness and recognized it. I'll meet him, Mason said. He walked down the steps, crouching a few feet away. Hi, Eli, he said gently. I'm Mason. This is Vega. No response. Eli's shoulders curled tighter, his eyes flicked up, then away. This is a place for kids who've been through hard things, Mason said. You're not the first to come through that gate with empty hands. Still nothing. Then Vega took one step forward. Not rushed, just presence. That's Vega's way of saying hi, Mason added. He doesn't bark. He just stays. Eli looked up briefly, long enough for Mason to see the kind of eyes that had seen fire and survived. Mason gave Vega a subtle hand signal. The dog lay down, paws crossed. He used to have a partner, Mason said. Someone who didn't talk either. But they understood each other just fine. The wind fluttered Eli's hoodie. Inside, Dr. Rivers closed her eyes at the window. Another broken soul had arrived. But broken wasn't the end. Sometimes it was the beginning. Mason stood but didn't step forward. Would you like to sit with Vega for a minute? You don't have to talk. A long silence. Then just an inch, Eli's foot shifted forward. Mason turned and walked slowly back to the porch. When he glanced over his shoulder, he saw it. Eli had come halfway up the path. Arms no longer crossed. Vega remained still, waiting. Eli knelt beside him, not touching, just near. And for the first time, Vega leaned gently beside him, offering warmth without demand. Eli didn't smile, but he didn't flinch. Clara stepped onto the porch. That's how I started too, she said quietly. I sat next to him, just sat. Mason looked at her. You see him? I see the quiet, she replied, and the fire behind it. Vega's tail lifted. A soft thump, Eli noticed. His lips didn't move, but his eyes flickered. A thought, a memory, or maybe just safety. And for now, that was enough. Later that afternoon, Clara saw him again. Eli stood by the field, arms crossed, a statue carved from ash. His eyes didn't land on anything they scanned, as if afraid the world might disappear if he looked too long. They said his house had burned, that he was the only one who survived. No word since, just silence. Clara didn't approach. She sat in the grass near the porch with a sketchbook. She wasn't drawing, just waiting. Beside her, Vega lay like a sentinel, grayer now, slower to rise, but still alert, still here. Vega noticed Eli before Clara did. He stood without a sound and began walking not directly at Eli, but in a wide arc, giving space. Eli's eyes narrowed, not with fear but defense, the look of someone unsure what's real anymore. Vega stopped 10 feet away. No barking, no wagging. He turned his head just enough to say, I see you then, lowered himself to the ground. Stillness. Eli's arms stayed crossed, but his eyes moved toward Vega. The dog was no longer just a shape. He was something else now. A quiet invitation. Clara watched with reverence. Eli stepped forward, half a step, then crouched. Not close, but eye level with Vega, breathing slower. Vega didn't move. He simply stayed. And after a long pause, he turned his head slightly and rested it with a sigh soft, deliberate. A sigh that said, "It's okay now." One of Eli's arms unfolded. He reached toward the ground. Not to touch, just closer. It was enough. Clara stood but didn't walk over. Her sketchbook stayed open on the porch, on the Paget drawing of a boy, a dog, and something that looked like a doorway. She stepped back inside. In the yard, Vega stayed. And Eli, for the first time since the fire, uncrossed both arms. The next morning arrived slowly mist, birdsong, and breath. Clara laid a patched blanket on the grass behind the cabin. At its center, she placed something she hadn't touched in years. A doll. One glass eye missing. Fabric charred. Blue dress faded to ash. She'd carried it through a fire encenau because it was valuable, but because it was the last gift from her mother. Now she placed it between her and the empty space beside her. Then she waited. Vega lay nearby, silent in the shade. Watching. Half an hour passed. Thina stepped behind her. Light, hesitant. She didn't turn. Another step. Then the sound of fabric on fabric. Eli sat. Not close, not touching the doll, but cross-legged, like her. "I used to think she was magic," Clara said. "When I held her, I wasn't scared at night." Eli didn't respond, but his head tilted. "I dropped her when the fire started. My brother yelled for me to run. I didn't. I went back." Her voice caught. "He went back for me. I came out holding her. He didn't." Silence held between them. Eli's fingers twitched on his knee. Vega's tail thumped once. Eli looked at him, then the doll, then Clara. Their eyes met, and for a moment, they just breathed. Clara reached forward, nudged the doll gently toward the blanket's center. "She's tired, but maybe she can help someone else now." Eli didn't move, but he blinked once, then leaned forward slowly. His scraped, hesitant hand hovered, then rested beside the doll. Not touching, just near. Like a truce, like a beginning. Vega stood and moved beside him. Eli didn't pull away, and Vega's tail thumped once more, a sound like trust. Clara's throat tightened, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Eli turned his face toward the doll. Thingently, 2 fingers brushed the edge of her dress. He didn't speak, but he didn't flinch. Healing doesn't begin with speeches, or even touch. Sometimes it begins with a doll, a dog, and the space between 2 people who choose not to run. Clara stayed still. Eli stayed close. And Vegaternal, watchful, kept guard. The sun broke through the trees, and the blanket held them all, together. The years didn't gallop. They unfolded soft, as the morning fog that once lingered over the garden where Clara had first smiled again. Time had a way of stitching together the frayed edges, not perfectly, not to erase, but to mend, tenderly. And in that mending, a quiet legacy bloomed. The Vega Pact had outgrown its small beginnings. It began with 1 dog, 1 child, and 1 shared silence. Now there were dozens dogs who'd once been too sensitive for combat, too broken for patrol duty, and children, many of them quiet as the sky before thunder, who no longer flinched when the wind slammed a door. In the facility's main hall, a mural had been painted. It showed Vega in profilinable, strong, eyes steady. Beneath him were handprints in every shade of skin and paw prints pressed into drying clay. At the center, a child's shaky handwriting read, "Not perfect, just brave." Mason stood often beneath that mural. He didn't speak much in public, but when he did, his words carried weight. His beard had grayed since the first day Vega bounded into his life, but his eyes had only grown softer, clearer. He watched as a new pair trained an anxious girl with a stutter and a retriever missing half an ear. The girl laughed when the dog fell over his own feet trying to fetch a ball. That sound-honest, unfiltered laughter was the kind of progress no chart could measure. "Another match?" Detective Rhodes asked one afternoon, arms folded as she leaned on the fence. Mason nodded, eyes never leaving the pair. "Not every wound bleeds, but every bond heals something." Vega, now slower but still regal, lay nearby on his favorite patch of warm earth. The sun lit the silver in his muzzle, his chest rising and falling with the ease of a creature at peace. Children still gravitated toward Heim, especially the newcomers. He never barked, he never rushed, but they came, always. And Clara had grown tall. She wore her hair differently now, tucked behind her ears, and her hands bore faint smudges of paint or clay almost daily. She volunteered after school, no longer as the one needing healing, but as the bridge for others to find it. One spring afternoon, she stood before a group of wide-eyed kids, holding a sketch pad. She flipped through the pages: dogs and children, gardens, blankets, silhouettes under suns. Then she showed them the first picture she'd ever drawn in therapy. A tree, a swing, a house with glowing windows, and a dark dog sitting beside a girl with no face. That, she said, pointing to the faceless girl, was me before Vega. Later, she tucked that picture into Vega's bed, where he slept now more than he ran. "You help me remember my face," she whispered, "so I can help them find theirs." There were photos in the office frames lining the shelf. Children from all over the state, some smiling, some not. All of them with dogs by their side. Not perfect, just brave. Mason had kept Vega's silver badge mounted beside them, not for decoration, but for what it meant. The first of his kind to be recognized, not for catching criminals, but for helping children catch their breath. At the annual Vega-packed gathering, hundreds came. Some wore suits, others jeans. Some walked on prosthetics. Others held service dogs close like lifelines. And in the center stage, beneath soft lights and banners painted by kids, a video played, Clara running arms open toward Vega in a garden. Mateo's balloon in the drawing that came later. Eli sitting beside a blanket and a doll once burned. All the ways healing had a face, and sometimes a tail. The audience didn't clap at the end. They stood in silence, moved, some with hands over hearts, some with tears they didn't bother to hide. Rhodes leaned over to Mason, her voice barely a breath. "Do you ever think this is what Major would have wanted?" Mason looked down at the badge. "He was the first dog I thought I failed. Vega showed me I didn't." Outside, dusk settled. Fireflies blinked lazily in the tall grass. The garden still stood. Clara had planted sunflowers there. Now huge things. Faces turned upward. Vega's favorite blanket was on the porch nearby, though he hardly ever needed it anymore. Children passed, whispering his name like a story passed from one small heart to another. From the top of the hill, the facility looked like a hominot, a hospital, not a center. Just a home, glowing from within. And Vega, who once bore the weight of every tremor and gunshot in his bones, lay with his head resting gently on his paws, watching as Eli laughed with a new friend. A second chance pack. A girl with a dog missing a paw. A boy who once stared at the ground, now pointing to the stars. The sun had come back, and it stayed. The rain tapped lightly against the glass windows, a soft percussion that filled the quiet office like a memory. Outside, the world was damp and gray, but inside, the room glowed with the warm amber hue of a desk lamp, casting soft shadows across the shelves lined with children's drawings and books with frayed corners. A plush armchair sat opposite a low couch, worn from years of quiet conversations. Clara sat curled on the couch, not as the child who once couldn't speak, but as a young woman of 13. Her hair was longer now, held back with a blue ribbon she'd tied herself. Her posture was straighter, more assured, but in her eyes, there still lingered a trace of the girl who once only spoke through crayons. Across from her, Dr. Yates, the same therapist who'd first met her when she wouldn't even look. People in the eye listened, legs crossed, a notepad resting untouched on her lap. She didn't need to write anything down. Not today, because today, Clara had asked to speak, not about Vega's current role, not about the younger kids she helped now, the ones she welcomed with soft smiles and worn blankets. Not even about Mateo, whose balloon from that first drawing still hung above her bed at home, slightly deflated, but never forgotten. Number today was about that day, and Clara's voice, when it came, didn't tremble. "It wasn't the scream," she began, eyes focused somewhere just beyond the room. "It wasn't the fire, or even the sirens. She paused, then looked up slowly. It was the sound Vega made. Dr. Yates said nothing, only nodded, encouraging, gentle, patient. Clara exhaled. That low growl, she said. It wasn't angry. Not like the dogs in the stories people warned me about. It wasn't warning me either. It was like he was holding something back, like the earth itself knew something was wrong. The words came easier now, no longer snagging on fear or silence. And I remember I was frozen. Everyone else moved, screamed, ran, but I couldn't. Her fingers curled slightly in her lap. I remember watching that man, that thing coming closer, and then that sound. She tapped her chest lightly. It vibrated in here, not loud, just enough. Her voice softened, became something sacred. That's when I knew I was safe. Dr. Yates blinked slowly, her throat working to hold in the emotion building behind her own silence. It wasn't the bark that came after, Clara continued. Not the sirens, not Mason shouting, not even when Vega tackled him. It was the growl, that one quiet growl. She smiled gently, a crescent moon of memory, because it wasn't just a warning for the man. It was a promise to me. Outside, the wind caught the corner of a wind chime. It clinked like a lullaby. I think, Clara went on, some people feel safe when they're held, or when someone says, it's okay. But for me, it was that sound. Low, steady. From a creature everyone else said I should be afraid of. Dr. Yates leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees. Do you remember what you felt in that exact moment? She asked softly. Clara nodded. Stillness, she said. Like time just listened. Like even the fire had to pause. Her voice cracked, but she didn't flinch. I knew he wouldn't let anything hurt me. Not even if he got hurt. There was a long, reverent silence in the room. I've never forgotten it, Clara whispered. She glanced at the bookshelf, where a photo rested in a silver frame. Vega, head slightly tilted, eyes like deep water, and next to him, Clara, 6 years younger, holding his paw like a promise. I think that's why I trust so easily now, she said. Not everyone, just enough to know that not all people leave. Some stay, some growl. Dr. Yates smiled gently. That's a beautiful way to say it. I used to think healing meant forgetting, Clara said. But now I think it means remembering differently. End quote. Her fingers brushed against the cloth bracelet on her wrist, the one made from pieces of Vega's old service vest. It was faded now, edges fraying, but she wore it every day. I want to remember the growl, not the fire, not him, just the growl. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. Because it wasn't just a warning, she repeated, voice firmer. It was a whisper, Vega's whisper, and it said, I see you. I'm here. You're not alone. Dr. Yates placed a hand over her heart, moved in a way only truth can move someone. Do you know what that sound was, Clara? She asked. Clara looked up. It was love, Dr. Yates said, wrapped in instinct. Clara smiled again, not the practiced kind, not the polite one. This one was real, the kind that came from someone who had walked through fire and still chose to sing. The afternoon light spilled across the art room like a blessing worm, soft, almost reluctant to leave. Outside, wind teased the tall grasses. Somewhere distant, a chime rang, the kind that hung on porches and whispered when the world was still. Inside, Clara sat alone at the table near the window. Her hair was longer now, brushed neatly behind her ears. No longer the fragile, wide-eyed child who once clung to silence like a life raft. She looked composed, almost adult, but there was a trace of something still sacredly childlike in her gaze. Her fingers, smudged with pastels and charcoal, moved deliberately across the paper. This wasn't just art. It never was. Not here. Mason walked past the doorframe, paused, then stepped inside, without a word. He'd learned to wait, to let the silence breathe before filling it with adult questions. Clara didn't look up at first. She was shading the lower branches of the tree with a deep green, letting the colors blend like memory and meaning. Then she set the pastel down, exhaled lightly and said, He always liked this spot. Mason followed her gaze to the tree on the hill outside the one near the first meeting blanket, now worn by time and sun. It had become sacred ground to many, especially to Clara, especially to Vega. He did, Mason said gently. He'd sit for hours, like he was waiting for someone he already knew would come. Clara smiled faintly, lips barely parting. Maybe he was. The drawing was nearly finished. It was simple, even quiet, in its composition. A girl, a dog, no names, no doll placed protectively between them, like a barrier of history. No walls, no fear. They sat under the same tree, but this time the girl's hands were open. One rested on the ground beside the dog. The other was offered, palm up, to no one and to everyone, and the dog wasn't shielding her anymore. He was beside her, not between her and the world. Above the scene, drawn not in bold, demanding strokes, but in tender script that curved with care, were the words, "You are not alone." Mason took a step closer, heart full and still. "Is this the last one?" he asked softly. Clara didn't answer immediately. She looked at the drawing a long time, then set her pencil down with a gentle click that felt like a door closing or opening. "I think so," she said. "Not because there's nothing more to say, but because this says it." Mason nodded. He didn't pretend to know what it meant for her to place that doll in the past, to draw open hands instead. But he respected it like a sacred right. "He'd be proud," he said finally. Clara's eyes welled not with grief, not even quite with joy, just fullness. A kind of ache that only comes from healing, when the scar still remembers the wound. "I hope he knows," she whispered, "how much he gave, not just to me, to all of us." They stood quietly, the two of them, watching the drawing as if it could breathe. And perhaps, in some way, it did. From outside came the distant sound of children laughing. New voices, young voices, unbroken. Some still carried shadows in their laughter, but they laughed all the same. The Second Chance pack had grown 7 dogs now, each with a history, each with a name no one said with pity. The children who arrived here still came broken, but they left lighter. The Vega Pact had spread farther than Mason ever dreamed. There were satellite programs now, pilot studies, even legislation being considered something about emotional animal therapy reform with Vega's name on the heading. But none of that mattered here, in this moment, more than what Clara had drawn. A girl, a dog, a tree. No dolls, no masks, just presence. "I want this framed," Mason said at last, "for the main hall." Clara chuckled. "You mean the wall with all the official photos?" He smirked. "Number the wall with the soul." She smiled, wider now. It felt earned. "Okay," she whispered. "But no glass. Let it breathe. Let it breathe," he echoed. Outside, Vega's tree swayed slightly in the wind. The blanket beneath it had faded, but not forgotten. Mason would sometimes find new children sitting there, not because they were told to, but because something in the space felt known. Maybe that was the legacy. Not a headline or an award, but this, a patch of ground where broken things no longer feared they'd stay broken. Clara lifted the drawing, careful not to smudge it. "I think I'll title it The Final Drawing," she said. Mason's eyes softened. "Final doesn't mean finished," he said. She nodded. "I know. It just means I'm ready." And as she stepped into the light spilling from the hallway, holding the drawing like something sacred and true, Vega's silhouette still rested gently in the lines. Not guarding, not waiting, just staying. A quiet promise, drawn in charcoal and courage. You are not alone. Sometimes, all it takes is a quiet moment beside a dog to remind us we're not alone in this world. Stories like Vega's and Clara's are more than stories. They're gentle truths about love that doesn't ask for words, and loyalty that stands firm even when everything else feels uncertain. German shepherds, with their steady eyes and unshakable hearts, seem to carry that kind of love effortlessly. Maybe that's why they so often find their way into the broken corners of our lives and somehow bring light with them. If this story stirred something in you, maybe it's time to sit a little longer with your own dog. Or if you've ever wondered how to build that kind of bond, There are places that can help, real, heartfelt resources for deepening that connection. No pressure, just something to keep in your back pocket if the moment feels right. Because sometimes healing comes on 4 paws, and sometimes it starts with simply showing up, open hands, open heart. Take care of your heart and theirs.